All right, guys. So, super stoked to have you both on here, Dr. Chaffee, Dr. Nagra. Thank you both for agreeing to have a debate and a conversation, really, about a lot of different topics going around. Dr. Chaffee, you are a proponent of the carnivore diet slash lifestyle, and Dr. Nagra, you're a proponent of being vegan or the vegan lifestyle slash diet. What I'm hoping we can start with is just kind of all of us agreeing, as we already just did, to kind of the rules where we're going to go. I'll state the question, you guys will state your stance on it, the other person will state their stance on it, and then from there we're just going to have an open conversation about what each other says, and then after that we'll move on to the next topic. Sound good?
Sounds
Sounds good to me.
Right on. Okay, so why don't we start with both of you guys giving just a quick, bullet point layout of who you are and why you're credible to speak on this approach to life. So, Dr. Nagra, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I'm a naturopathic doctor in Vancouver, BC, out in Canada. I have been out to Perth, though, Anthony. I know that's around where you're based. Back in 2009. Record summer, by the way. It was like 45 degrees or something. But I am, yeah, it was crazy. But yeah, so I've been plant-based. I've been vegan for about 12 and a half years, started shifting a bit prior to that. I had certain, health issues when I was younger, overweight, asthma, and so on, and I did see, large improvements, and that's what ultimately got me interested. Of course, from there, I did more research and went through school, got a bachelor's in microbiology, took additional nutrition classes, and just kind of continued on from there. And I use nutrition a lot in my practice as well, largely dealing with people with cardiometabolic diseases or cardiometabolic risk factors and helping them improve those. I've also been a contributing author, or rather a scientific fact checker for The Proof is in the Plants, best-selling book out in Australia, as well as a contributing author to Professional Health nutrition textbook, and here to discuss my views on nutrition. So there you go.
Awesome. Thank you. And Dr. Chaffee.
I'm an American medical doctor. I currently practice in Perth, Australia, as Matt said. So I have been researching diet and nutrition for, really about 25 years. I started studying nutrition in my undergraduate degree in Washington. I studied nutrition. I got my degree in molecular and cellular biology, and that culminated in a medical degree after that. Since then, I have found that nutritional interventions are extremely potent, as you have as well, and that whatever we're eating, we're doing it wrong, and people are getting very sick and they're getting unwell, and so some things need to be changed. And so I've taken quite a lot of time looking at research and different studies and pieces of evidence to try to figure out what we are biologically and what we're biologically designed to eat and what would be the most healthful way to eat. I think there's an absolutely huge array and gambit of different things that we could eat and be relatively healthy. The predominant diet at the moment is very unhealthy, and so I think that's, no matter what we do, I think we need to change that, and we need to go into a direction of a different direction than we're going now. So I am a proponent of a carnivore diet. I feel that just is biologically what we're designed to eat, and I think that is the most healthful, but I don't think that's the only healthful diet. There's certainly a wide array of people that can be extremely healthy on different diets as well. So I do that personally because I find that that's best for me, and I use that in my practice quite a lot, and I find this is very beneficial to my patients as well. But I certainly don't think that this is the only thing. I mean, I have vegetarian patients, who for religious reasons, they're like, look, I just can't. I can do eggs, that's it. And it's just like, okay, we'll work with that and do the best we can with them. So that's my position anyway.
Gotcha. Okay.
And
yeah,
just
that's
a
great.
spot of common ground, if I could say, I think we both agree that the predominant Western diet, so to speak, at this point is not the best. So it's nice to start off with a point of common ground.
There's something in
definitely.
common. Brings about another question that I want to bring and circle back to after we get to these ones. So we'll see how quickly we go. But the first one it's pretty straightforward. It really is. What are humans biologically and evolutionarily designed to eat? And pretty straightforward question. That's not a matter of just maybe what we like, what tastes good and all that, but what are we designed to eat? So we'll start there. Dr. Nagra, if you want to start first on this one.
Sure. And with regard to biological adaptations, I mean, we have adaptations to carbohydrates. We have 10 to 20 times the amylase gene that our Neanderthal cousins do, for example. But at the end of the day, I don't see why having adaptations to a certain food or a certain dietary practice means that it's best for us long term. And to understand that, let's just talk a little bit about how natural selection works, right? We all have genes. We pass down our genes to our offspring, our children, and those who reproduce more are going to end up spreading their genes more. And throughout evolution, genes that help us get to that point of reproducing are the ones that are passed on. Genes that don't necessarily help us get to that point eventually get weeded out of the population. A great example of this not necessarily leading to good long-term health is sickle cell anemia. So if we look at areas where malaria is endemic, sickle cell anemia actually helps protect against malaria. So kids won't die at very young ages due to malaria infections, but they can run into complications long-term, like cardiovascular complications beyond the reproductive window. And so there's no good reason, in my view, to think that even if we had adaptations to eating meat, that it's necessarily going to lead to good long-term health. And what I ultimately care about are those long-term health outcomes. Does it lead to a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, all-cause mortality, premature death, essentially? And just to highlight some of the data on that, I mean, we have food groups and the risk of all-cause mortality. We see that whole grain consumption, higher whole grain consumption, lower risk. Refined grains, not so much. I don't advocate for that. Vegetable consumption, higher intake, lower risk. Fruit consumption, nut consumption, legume consumption. Whereas on the flip side, eggs, dairy, red meat, processed meat, and sugar-sweetened beverages. Of course, I don't advocate for that. Fish consumption, on the other hand, seems to be quite protective. If we also look at biomarkers, so this isn't based on dietary intake, this is based on actual markers of intake of whole grains and nuts in particular. Enterolactone, a product that ends up in our blood after we consume lignans in those foods, those with the highest concentrations have a 30% lower risk of all-cause mortality and a 45% lower risk of cardiovascular disease mortality. If we look at long-term randomized controlled trials in the form of the Lyon Diet Heart Study, the main dietary changes, the statistically significant changes, were more bread, more fruit, and of course the bread was mostly whole wheat in this case, more fruit, more margarines, less butter and cream, less meat, and less delicatessen, which is like meat and cheeses, and a 70% lower risk of all-cause mortality. I see that's really small. It says 0.3 right there in the bottom right. And so when we're looking at the long-term health outcomes amongst people actually living today and following them over time, we see consistently that they end up doing better the more plant foods, at least those healthier plant foods I highlighted, not so much the refined grains and Coca-Colas, the better off they end up doing. So I think that would pretty much be it for my sort of opening.
And so, Dr. Chaffee, before you go really quick, does your stance then is that plants, 100%, like mainly plants, is the way to go?
So yes, in that, whether you're eating, say, 85-ish% to 100% plant-based, generally very, very healthy, whether or not there's, some small degree of benefit if you waver slightly to the right or left of that 100%, I haven't seen good evidence of there being a significant difference. So I would say diets like the Mediterranean, DASH, Portfolio, or a strictly exclusive plant-based diet as well can fit into that mold, but I'm not talking about the Oreo cookie potato chip diet, right? I'm specifically talking about this healthier iteration as I've outlined.
Got it. Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Dr. Chaffee, what about you? What is your stance on what are humans biologically and evolutionarily designed to eat?
Thank you very much. So is it possible to share screen?
Yeah, you just click share, bottom middle.
Yeah, so I think that it does matter biologically what we're designed to eat and what we're evolutionarily designed to eat for the simple reason that after 2 million years of adaptation to a specific food group, the likelihood that you have carried over or developed sensitivities and damage from that food group is extremely unlikely. I can't think of a single example in nature where you can take an animal that eats naturally in its wild environment and that's not the healthiest thing for them to eat. There are signs at the zoo that say don't feed the animals, because if you eat something that they don't eat in the wild, they get very, very sick. And that's the same with at parks and so on. And we know this in animal husbandry and livestock, or just veterinary medicine, that if animals eat outside of their evolutionary past, they will get very, very sick. And the reason being is that they're not designed. They're not designed for it, so they're not going to have the bioavailability. They're not going to be designed to break these foods down and get their nutritional resources. And there may be toxins in the different plants that they eat. We have a capacity to break down certain things, but not a complete one. This is where inedible plants come in, which is the majority of plants on Earth. So this is a concept that we understand. And so if you're not designed biologically to eat a certain food, that can instill harm to varying degrees. And so it is important. The idea that we would be better off eating something that we haven't eaten even 50 years ago. A lot of the food that we eat now didn't exist 50 years ago. Even the vegetables and fruits that we eat have been thoroughly bred and changed from their original form as well. And so the idea that we're biologically adapted to things that we really haven't eaten until very, very recently, I'm a bit skeptical of. Biologically, animals tend to adapt to their environment and adapt to their food source. And so as I'll share the screen here. Okay, so this is a study that came out of the University of Tel Aviv that showed that all the available evidence showed that humans were hypercarnivorous apex predators for at least the last 2 million years. So that is, just looking at the evidence there, and if you speak to different, sorry, I'm just having difficulty with the share screen thing here.
It was working.
And so, did you guys see that? Did that come
Yeah,
up?
it was up there.
Yeah.
It was up there. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So, if you speak to different paleoanthropologists and archaeologists, they will tell you that this is what the evidence shows, is that people have been eating meat, if not predominantly meat, sometimes even exclusively meat. Think about in the ice ages. When the ice sheets started coming down, the fossil record shows that people are actually moving up away from the equator and into the ice shelves. So there really isn't any plants available then. So predominantly what they're going to be eating is meat. And that is, I had another point there, but that is the idea that we have evolved to eat meat, and we're biologically adapted to it. If we weren't able to survive solely on meat, then we really wouldn't be doing very well through the ice ages. We have the Inuit in northern Canada and Alaska. When eating their normal diet, they are actually quite healthy, and there are many studies looking at this over the course of the 20th century that early on they have pretty low prevalence of disease, heart disease, cancer, diabetes. And as the decades go on, as they're becoming more incorporated into Western society, those rates go up and up and up. But even as far as 1996, there was a study out of Canada that looked and found that even though the Inuits, previously called Eskimos, the Inuits start smoking at very early ages, sometimes as on average as early as 8 years old, that their heart disease rate was actually quite a lot lower than the rest of Canada. And they thought maybe this was a genetic factor, so they looked at all their genes and said, okay, maybe they're genetically designed to withstand heart disease. They found that no, actually they had all the risk factors, genetic risk factors for developing heart disease. So they said, look, we really don't know why that is. Fast forward another 10 years, 20 years, they say, well, actually, the heart disease rate isn't all that low in Inuits. Well, that's because more and more of them are incorporated into Western society and eat a lot of junk food and alcohol and things like that. And so, when we, you mentioned sickle cell, and that's a good example, because if you have, homozygous sickle cell genetic adaptation, that obviously is a problem for life. But if you're heterozygous, then that confers a benefit to malaria, but it doesn't confer the health risks. So on a population level, you get long-term survival improvement for the population. But I agree that those people that get hit with the double homozygous, they're not doing very well. But because more are going to be heterozygous, that confers a long-term survival for the population. You mentioned the DASH diet as well. There was a recent study. I don't have it up, unfortunately. This just reminded me of it when you spoke about it. But there's actually a ketogenic diet was actually shown to be more efficacious than the DASH diet as well.
Wait, sorry.
And that's not
Sorry,
to say that you can't
I just missed that little what you said there. If you could just repeat it, please.
Oh, I was just saying that there are other diets that like the ketogenic diet actually recently got shown to be even better than the DASH diet. And that's not to say you can't do a ketogenic diet on a plant-based diet, because you certainly can. And so that's not just advocating solely for meat. But a lot of times when we're looking at the different studies looking at, is this diet better than another diet, quite often we are comparing them to the standard norm. So we don't really have things that are comparing a whole food plant-based diet that you espouse and a whole food meat-based diet as I espouse. Generally, they're just equated to the standard. So you can have more fruits and vegetables, and that's better than the standard, and I certainly would agree with that. But there's also the study out of Harvard with 2,000 carnivores, self-reported, a lot of these are, that showed improvements to the standard diet. So neither of these are going to show, is it better compared to a whole food plant-based diet and a whole food meat-based diet. There was, I'm trying to bring it up here, there was a recent study out of the UK. I'll try to share my screen here.
And yeah, Dr. Nagra, if you want to come, respond to any of this.
Yeah. I was kind of waiting my turn, but whenever it's possible.
Yeah. I'll wrap it up here.
Okay.
There we go. So this one it was a long-term perspective study with 400,000 people in the UK, and they found that accounting for confounding factors, socioeconomic factors, healthy user bias, that this actually eliminated the benefits associated with plant-based diets. So they looked at whole food plants, cooked and raw. They found that raw conferred a better cardiovascular benefit than cooked. Cooked didn't show any. But when you accounted for the confounding factors, that this was eliminated as well.
Can you just keep that up for a sec? Oh, sorry. I was wondering if you can just, I can pull it up, or you can keep it up.
That's fine.
Okay. Whenever I respond, I just want to touch on that one really quick.
Yeah, of course. So that's the main thing. I mean, there are studies that compare what we're talking about, which is whole food plant-based diet and meat-based diet. And we can certainly get into those as well. But just from a biological evolutionary standpoint, I think that it's that the evidence does show quite clearly that that we did evolve eating meat, and the biological premise that what you're adapted to is what's going to be beneficial to you, I think stands here. One thing I will point out is that people say that, and this is a bit weird, sorry, there's weird ads here, that they say, well, these people probably didn't live all that long. There's no real good evidence for that. What that's based on is average life expectancy from birth. But here you can see that that's not really the same thing as how long people live when they just die of old age. So back in 1850, if you were at 0, the average life expectancy was 38. So people can say, oh, well, people were dying in their 30s. Well, not really, because if you made it to 10 years old, on average, you would make it another 48 years, you'd make it to 58. And it goes up from there and there and there and there. And so by the time you got up to 70, you were likely to make it into your 80s and so on. And that stayed pretty constant. It went up a little bit. It went down again in the 1900s and then started going up again sort of the middle of the century, middle to late last century. And that's gone up a little bit. But that's the problem we run into when we're dealing with average life expectancy from birth.
All right.
Okay,
so yeah,
let
just
me-
on
let
this.
me- yeah, go ahead, Nagra.
Yeah, just on the study. Do you mind scrolling down to table 2 for a sec?
Sure. Yeah, no, I got onto it. I tried clicking it to bring it up
Okay.
and to blow it up, but it's not doing it.
Can you see it? Oh, now you can. So this is the
Yep.
paper, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, and in your view, this is one of the better ones on the topic, presumably?
No, not at all. I think all studies have inherent flaws. The point is that there's mixed literature, and
Wait,
none of these studies are really all that great because a lot of them have all these confounding factors.
So I
And
just
so
want to address.
it's really difficult to make comparisons.
So I just want to address something though. So you said that this study found no benefit, right?
No.
After
So it
after
found
adjusting
benefit.
for confounders.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it found really no benefit with cooked vegetables. It found a benefit with uncooked, but it thought that there was probably confounders that were getting in the way of that. So again, it's not a perfect study, and it's not saying conclusively that vegetables don't provide any benefit. But again, you also have to think about the comparison. What are we comparing?
Well, so,
comparing
sorry.
this to?
Can
They're
I
comparing that.
just show what I wanted to show,
Yeah.
please? Yeah.
Sure.
So this is table 2. This is what I was trying to get you to go to. If we look at all-cause mortality, cooked vegetables were beneficial, 19% lower risk of all-cause mortality in the fully adjusted model. So that is when you're adjusting for all the confounders, including BMI and whatnot. So it actually was beneficial, as was raw, very similarly beneficial, as was total vegetable intake. So I'm just confused as to why you said there was no benefit.
On cardiovascular risk.
Yeah, but for all-cause mortality, are we in agreement that there was benefit? And this is only for over 4 tablespoons of vegetable intake.
Oh yeah, no. I was speaking specifically about cardiovascular risk.
Okay.
But
Okay,
no, look, I agree.
I just want to make clear, for all-cause mortality, we agree there was benefit.
Mhm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and that's no, absolutely. So
Yeah.
so let me again clarify. I'm not saying that this study proves that vegetables are not good for you. I'm saying that there is mixed literature. And I'm also just pointing out that when you're comparing these things, you're comparing them to the norm standard diet, which we both agree is not great. So it's difficult to glean more information than that because we don't have comparative studies to whole food plant-based diet with whole food meat-based diet, except for one, which we can talk about, which is...
We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that. I'd like to have my response because there was a lot of things to unpack there. So another thing you mentioned was obviously there's a lot. I'm not going to go through every single point, just hit on some of the big ones. But another thing you mentioned was this one, right? The Harvard Carnivore study, right? Yeah, and so what happened to the coronary artery calcium scores in people who had scans before and after adopting carnivore?
Yeah. So the thing is, again...
Again, I'm just asking, but I understand. I just want to point out, right? I don't see how, what the purpose of citing this study is if we're just accepting certain findings but not others, right? Like coronary artery calcium for people who had pre-diet scores was 55. For those who also had the post-diet was 81, right? We actually saw an increase in coronary artery calcium. And so I just want to point out that I don't see the reason. Oh, sorry, I'm not sharing the right tab here. That's my bad. It's weird how it does that.
I wanted to say something, but I didn't interrupt your flow.
Yeah. It's weird that it doesn't share that. But I just want to point out that, if we're going to cite studies, presumably we look at the full set of results. We look at the outcomes. I'm just waiting for it to load up. Yeah. So here's the coronary artery. We have 55 here. We have 81 post or current. So pre-diet was 55. And so we actually see a progression of coronary artery calcium in these self-selected carnivores through the World Carnivore Tribe and the Carnivore Reddit and all of that, presumably who are very strong proponents of that, right? It's imagine if I were to go on my social media and say, hey, let's survey a bunch of vegans about their health. Obviously, there would be a selection bias. So I just think this is a really pretty terrible study, actually, if I'm honest about that. But going back to this whole idea of biological adaptation, I did sort of point out why that isn't necessarily beneficial long term. There's no reason to select for something that helps us out post-reproductive age. It only matters to get to that reproductive window and to reproduce and pass those genes on. And like you said, we're only looking at replacing the standard American diet. That's actually not true. We have substitution analyses that specifically model the replacement. I have to unshare and share again here. That specifically model the replacement of red meat and specifically unprocessed red meat and plant protein sources. So here, other animal protein sources as well, replacing unprocessed red meat with In this case, it was dairy, nuts, or legumes was beneficial for cardiovascular disease, a meta-analysis of prospective cohorts there. And in this study by Huang et al., this was the NIH AARP study published back in 2020, replacement of just 3% of calories from red meat protein with plant protein was associated with a 13% lower risk of all-cause mortality in men and a 15% lower risk of all-cause mortality in women. And this is the adjustment model if there were any concerns. If anything, I'd say they over-adjusted. But a very, very comprehensive adjustment model. And this is specifically looking at that replacement, right? If we took people and they were to swap out a bit of the red meat they're eating with some plant protein sources, they end up living longer and having a lower risk of disease. So it's not just this idea of replacing the standard American diet. And then the last thing I'll mention really quick about like zoo animals. So like, are you suggesting that the zoo animals don't get disease in the wild or in zoos because they're fed their species appropriate diet, or wondering about
disease insofar as getting infections, but they don't get diabetes and autoimmune disorders.
What about like
when they're eating
cancers, cardiovascular disease?
No, not really. It's much lower. And
so actually, let's look at that too really quick here. Just again, I'm just trying. You threw out a lot of points. I just want to make sure I touch on some of the big ones. So you look at cancer risk amongst mammals or across mammals, and these are in zoos. Being fed their presumably species-specific diet, as you put it. 110,000 animals.
Does it say that specifically?
Yeah. So they talk about meat in particular, like meat intake amongst the carnivores, and I'll tell you why. I'm going to get to that in a second here. So if we look at the different types of animals too, we actually see that the cancer rates are the highest amongst carnivores, even though they're eating this meat, raw meat largely. The herbivores primates have a lower rates of cancer mortality. We look at rodents, lower rates of cancer mortality, and so on. It's spiking up like crazy here, and we can see the kind of the means on the cancer mortality rate, right here on the right side. So these animals absolutely do get cancer, and they develop that. If we also look at arthritis amongst animal skeletons from zoos, we see that they also develop arthritis. In fact, even marine mammals do, which is kind of interesting. And I'm pulling that up here. So these diseases do exist in the wild and in zoos where they're presumably being fed appropriately. As you said, you're not supposed to feed animals because they have very specific diets that they're adhering to. So I just don't see any bearing on this idea that, well, animals don't get the disease if they're eating according to their quote-unquote species-specific diet. And at the end of the day, this all comes back to outcomes. Like I said, replacing animal protein, red meat protein in particular, with plant protein sources has consistently been shown to lead to lower mortality risk, lower cardiovascular disease risk in virtually every cohort that there has been looking at that. NIH, AARP, Nurses Health, Health Professionals Follow-Up, JPHC. The Rotterdam study was actually carbs for animal protein, and the list goes on and on. So what I'd be really interested to hear is, what is the fundamental issue that applies to those studies, even though they're done in different populations by different researchers using different methodologies, that would explain those results?
Well, I'd have to look at each individual study to know. But the fact, so you talked about the Harvard study, and you picked on one point, which is a CAC score, but isn't it also true that taking a statin, which is generally accepted as beneficial for heart disease and its prevention, raises your CAC score as well?
It can.
So,
yeah.
Okay, so is raising a CAC score inherently bad if we do it on purpose with statins?
No, it's not inherently bad. I'm not saying it's inherently bad, but what I'm saying is we actually don't glean much useful information from that study, nor can we say that those people are better off, after versus before the carnivore diet. And of course, there's the huge issue of selection bias. Like I said, if I went on my social media like, hey, if you got better on a vegan diet, sign up for this survey, presumably nobody would accept that as good science, right? And it's really the same thing that occurred there.
So again, the point I was making with that was not that this is the end all be all study. I was specifically saying it was flawed and saying that it wasn't showing what I wanted to show, what we wanted to talk about. I said specifically that this is not comparing like for like. This is not showing us what we want to see. We want to see whole food plant-based diet, whole food meat-based diet. And we want to do it in a rigorous fashion. And I was saying that wasn't it. And I was also saying that there are other examples. So I was actually being disparaging of my own side, saying that we don't really have good studies in that regard. As far as the zoo animals are concerned and the animals in the wild, I would be interested to see, if they were able to control for being fed outside of their diet. I would also be interested to see, but that also doesn't presuppose that, just because they get certain illnesses in that environment, that if they were eating otherwise, they wouldn't get worse. There were studies.
It doesn't tell us either way. I will acknowledge that. It doesn't actually tell us either way, of course. Like in the wild, maybe sick animals, maybe they do get sick, but they just die quicker, so we can't properly study. Like that, it could go either way. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So there was a study, and I'm sorry I don't have it up, but just reminded me of it.
I think I have to cut this question, unfortunately, unless
I'm fine. Like I feel like this is inherent to the discussion personally, but like it's totally up to you two as well, Anthony, if you care.
Well,
I'll make maybe just a quick couple points.
Yeah.
And then we can move on. It's just the matter of study with it looked at elephants and whales. And it said, these are huge animals. They've got a lot of cells and tissue. They should have higher rates of cancer. There's more cells that can go wrong and turn cancerous, but they found they had very, very low, negligible cancer rates. And they were like, okay, well, what is this? And they sort of looked at that. They came up with sort of genetic reasons for that. But the point is that it's very low. Elephants obviously being large herbivores. Whales being large carnivores, they're just eating meat basically, or plankton and things like that, or krill, I should say. So that's just that point. The point about reproduction age, only getting to reproduction age, that's the only benefit. That's not quite true, because you get to reproduction age, you have kids. If you die immediately, your kids are dead. You have to be able to wean them and bring them to adulthout as well.
Through the reproductive window, yes, I would agree. Through really at the end of the day, you're talking about till about 40 or so, 40, 45. I would grant that. I'm just not saying into like the 70s, 80s, 90s. Just to be clear, right? There's no advantage to living that long.
Well, it's societally, I think it is. You have the elders and the wise men, all these sorts of things that pass down that information, and you have the grandfathers and great grandfathers who pass down human knowledge and experience, and so there can be a societal benefit. But you're right. The minimum that you need is to get to, say, 40, so that your kids are adults and they can at least fend for themselves. But even in the different population studies, looking at like Malcolm Gladwell wrote about this in Outliers, you have different populations genetically sort of doing things differently in different areas, and they didn't have the same longevity outcomes. Whereas the areas that they had better longevity is when they had 3 generations, 4 generations living in the same household, and everyone was helping out and taking care of things. So I think there is an advantage to that. But you're right, the strict cutoff, I think, is not just at reproduction age, though. It's probably double or more than that. And then the one piece of information.
Can I just add just one quick point on that last thing you said? Just one point. I would say, though, as an alternative hypothesis, it could even be detrimental, as you're actually feeding resources, perhaps, to keeping someone alive who isn't going to be passing down genetic material, who isn't going to be helping reproduce. So it could go either way.
That's why the Inuit go and expose themselves, right? That was the thing when they're too old to chew their leather. They just go outside and they expose themselves. Say, hey, we're not pulling our weight. These are harsh environments, and so we got to go. But they don't do that at 40. They were doing that when their teeth wore out to such a degree that they couldn't chew on skins anymore and help at least make leather and things like that. So
it doesn't sound like they were very healthy then.
No, we're not rats, right? We don't regrow our teeth, so they wear down. And so if you're using your teeth as a tool, they're going to wear down. It's not that they're falling out or rotting. And in fact, that gets me to another point, which is pre and post agriculture. Archaeologists know the skeleton is pre and post agriculture, so there's a hard line. Before agriculture, teeth were much better, jaws were better developed, less cavities, less lost teeth. Brains were 11% larger, on average 5 inches taller. After agriculture, brains smaller, stature smaller, teeth are crowded, crooked, broken, cavities, and they have shorter femurs, which is a sign of malnutrition, and signs of tuberculosis in their spines and bones. That is also obviously signs of ill health. And so you can see a clear cutoff when we change dramatically our population-wide diet, that there was significant developmental ramifications because of that.
With regard to agriculture, we didn't need to hunt anymore as much. We didn't need to be on our feet and as large. As far as brain size, that doesn't, so we didn't select for it as much. As far as brain size doesn't dictate intelligence. I mean, look at the largest brains in the world, sperm whales, for example, and a few other large mammals. They aren't more intelligent than us. You even look at brain to body size ratio. Shrews have a bigger brain to body size ratio than we do. They aren't smarter than us. Our number of neurons, as far as I'm aware, has not significantly declined. If anything, may have gone up. And so we are more intelligent, so to speak, than we would have been back then. And so I don't see how that has any bearing. And ultimately, it comes back to those long-term health outcomes that I care about. Well, it could be the case that we just didn't. I just want to address.
Come back to that, and I think it's worth coming back to. I think we should move on to the next one. The question is basically, can you get adequate nutrition from a plant-based diet?
Depends what you mean. If you mean plant only, no supplementation, fortification, well then no, I'd say that's not adequate. I advocate for people to supplement appropriately. Obviously, the one that everyone is aware of is vitamin B12. And when we supplement appropriately and we look at populations who are doing that, we see that they do just fine. They have similar rates or similar nutrient status and rates of deficiency to omnivorous counterparts who are eating a lot more animal products. I mean, we see this out of some research. I'll just actually share my screen again real quick. Research out of Switzerland. I mean, there are a bunch of other papers as well that I could pull from, but I really like the one out of Switzerland because they looked at rates of deficiency as well. Where is it? Right here. And so if you're looking at omnivore vegans on the right, similar rates of low magnesium, similar rates of low hemoglobin, plasma ferritin, similar for zinc, similar for iodine. Mind you, everybody was low in iodine, presumably not having much like iodized salt or what have you, or fish in this population, or seaweed for people eating plants. Vitamin A was similar, beta carotene, vitamin E, C. Actually, for C, the omnivores tended to be a little bit higher as far as rates of deficiency, but that wasn't significant. B2, roughly similar. B6, actually the vegetarians were higher there, but the omnivores and vegans very similar. B12, no significant differences. Folic acid, actually the omnivores were lower. And actually, speaking of that, Michaela Peterson publicly acknowledged that her folate levels were low when she tested them, and so she started supplementing with that as well on a carnivore diet. But this all just comes back to what I was talking about before, is that like if we can get all of our nutrition with a plant-based diet plus appropriate supplementation, and it leads to better health outcomes, lower rates of cancer incidence based on this meta-analysis from 2017, lower risk of ischemic heart disease based on this meta-analysis from earlier this year, vegans compared to non-vegetarians. What's the problem? Why do we need to consume a diet that doesn't come with supplementation, right? It doesn't make a lot of sense when the health outcomes are suggesting that it is healthy, and again, that's what I care about. Maybe not everybody cares about the health outcomes, but that would be my kind of position or my response to that question.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Dr. Chaffee. Yep. What do you say about, can you get an adequate amount of nutrition from just a plant-based diet?
Yeah, well, I think that is an important point, and that if a diet is lacking in specific essential nutrients like B12, but there are more, then that cannot be our evolved biologically appropriate diet. And this doesn't even go into bioavailability of different nutrients, because there are quite a lot of nutrients that are locked up in ways that we can't access. There are traditional methods of releasing them, like nixtamalization in maize. It releases a lot of the nutrients like niacin and detoxifies them. This is where tamales come from, is that process of nixtamalization. And cooking and all these sorts of things can bring out these nutrients. But what does that mean? That means we are not designed to do it naturally ourselves. And so I think that inherently is important when we're talking about what we're supposed to eat. As far as just hopping back to the change, is it a bad thing that our brains are smaller? Well, I think it is, and I don't think that it's that you can say that it was a selection factor, because this was a hard line. It wasn't. It's gradually happened over the
like
course
one
of
generation
10,000.
Or like. Like how quickly did it happen?
A couple hundred years, yeah. Well, that's out of a book. That's out of a book from Oxford University, and they said before agriculture, directly after agriculture, these were the differences.
Well, sure, but like I want to know how long, right? If that's taking place over thousands and thousands of years, it could totally just be a selection event. It's not as advantageous, right? It was in a book somewhere. I mean, I just prefer to see
I'll bring it up for you.
Yeah, please do. And like just to understand kind of how long that was, and if it, because the way that you're speaking about it, and maybe
that's the thing. So this doesn't say the time period that this does it. It just talked about just pre-agriculture and post-agriculture.
Yeah, because
but 10,000 years ago. So
agriculture
it says post-agriculture man 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, so I mean that's a fair amount of time. That's a lot of generations to pass down through, and as far as when that started and ended, and agriculture was introduced at different times in different places around the world.
So this is saying post-agricultural people 10,000 years ago.
Okay.
So not comparing us now to 10,000 years ago. It's comparing skeletons from 10,000 years ago to pre-agricultural man.
But to when? Like what part? Right? How long ago? Is that 100, 200,000 years ago pre-agricultural, or is it 12,000 years ago, right? 200,000? Yeah, so we need to know where that is, right? We can't just say, oh, it's a hard line, all of a sudden we see these changes happening in like a couple generations. We want to know, is that over many tens or hundreds of thousands of years? And so without seeing that, it's just really hard to buy that there was this hard line.
Well, unfortunately, I don't have the whole book handy. I only have this picture. You can see it here, and it's pre-agricultural man and post-agricultural man 10,000 years ago, and there was this sharp decline in height, and it goes through all the different sorts of issues in the skeletal deformations that they found. And so it doesn't say exactly when.
Yeah, it doesn't tell us when or how long. So I don't know how much of a.
I'm with you, but the what's being relayed here in that picture is this is like that this is a hard line. This is pre-agriculture. This is not 500,000 years ago. I'll try and find the book and send it to you, but that is what, and see where it says specifically that. Unfortunately, I don't have that with me right now, but that is what that is suggesting, is that this is a direct hard line. But in any case, the idea that we are optimal on a diet that is lacking in basic nutrients, I don't think that follows. There was, certainly there can be an issue with folate. People with the MTHFR gene mutation don't methylate folate properly, and so they might need a little bit more. But generally what they do is they just eat more liver, and that takes care of it. And I have a number of patients who have done that and have improved on that, and they don't need to take the engineered supplements. They can still just eat meat. They just have to add in a bit of organs, and so they can still get complete nutrition that way. There's more than B12. There's D3, obviously. There's K2. You can get K1 from plants, but it doesn't convert very well over to K2, and you need K2. That's required, and it's actually found to be in poor dentition and jaw development if you have a lack of K2. Vitamin A in its whole form, retinol, does not exist in plants. You got to get it from the carotenoids like beta carotene, but you have to eat quite a lot of these things to get enough vitamin A, sometimes as much as 6 pounds of carrots. And there are about 45% of people that are hypo metabolizers of beta carotene. So it's very difficult for them to get vitamin A as well. Carnitine, this is considered a non-essential amino acid because we make it, but there's evidence that as much as 30% of people don't make enough, and they do need that from their diet as well. And then you're looking at amino acid balance and bioavailability. This again, you can get a complete protein, you certainly can, from plants, but it's not necessarily in the right proportions. And if I can find one of these studies that's looking at plant source proteins that was not so favorable, and it was much more favorable with animal source proteins, if I can find it here.
While you're looking that up, do you mind if I just mention a couple things?
Sure.
Yeah. So I want to talk about each of these, the K2, vitamin A, things that you just mentioned, but I want to understand this idea of like, well, if you need to supplement, then the diet's inferior or not as healthy or optimal, so to speak. Let's just do a quick thought experiment. Let's say there's two diets, right? There's diet A, which provides everything that you need as far as essential nutrients, and then there's diet B, which provides most of what you need, but you do need to supplement a couple things. 2 things, 3 things, whatever, it doesn't matter to me here. Now, diet B also, and let's say we didn't know this definitively, leads to better long-term health outcomes, lower risk of cardiovascular disease, cancers, all-cause mortality, etc. Which of those 2 diets would you choose?
Well, it depends on the evidence, but I don't think you can argue.
For sake of the hypothetical, we have hard evidence. It meets every criteria that you need for causal inference.
But we don't, though.
No, but just hypothetically, we do. I'm trying to understand your values, right? And so, just in that hypothetical, if those are the 2 examples,
I don't think that follows. Because if you're biologically designed,
right. That's the whole. The debate is about that, right? The debate is about which is ultimately healthier. I'm just trying to understand if it were the case. If I were to show you this, would you accept that, right? So, in these 2 situations, hell, they aren't even carnivore and vegan. Let's just throw those out for a second. They're unnamed diets. We know nothing about them other than what I just said. Diet A provides all of what you need, other than all of what you need as far as essential nutrients. Diet B provides most, but we have to supplement a few things, but it leads to better long-term health outcomes. Which of those 2 would you say is healthier, would you choose?
Well, I think it's still a false comparison.
No, it's really not a false. It's a hypothetical to understand your values, right? So let's just put it this way. Wait, hold on. I'm saying the evidence.
No, I'm answering your question.
You're not answering it.
I'm trying to answer your question right now. If
you're not answering it,
you could show me hard evidence that I was convinced of.
And it is in this hypothetical.
I would go with the most helpful one.
Okay,
I would go with the most healthy one.
Okay, in the case
you could do that.
Yeah, so what that tells me is that what you care about are the health outcomes over things like whether or not you need to supplement, whether or not some things are biological diet, and so on. The health outcomes are the be-all, end-all above all of that. That's what that tells me. And so that brings us back to the health outcome data. You still haven't explained why it is the case that when we substitute red meat for plant protein sources, we see improvements in outcomes. You haven't been able to critique any of those studies so far, or explain to me why it is that vegans consistently do better than people following a diet, at least closer to what you're recommending in the case of omnivorous diets, more meat and dairy and whatnot. So that's ultimately.
I don't agree with your premise. I don't agree with that underlying premise.
Well, no.
That, something that we're not biologically designed for is going to be more healthy and it's going to have better health outcomes.
But here's the thing: I provided evidence that swap of red meat from even unprocessed red meat across different populations, different research groups, different study designs, including long-term randomized controlled trials, leads to better outcomes long-term.
And there are other studies that say the opposite.
But hold on. I'm happy to address all of those too. But what is the fundamental issue? Like, surely you're familiar with the Nurses' Health Study or Health Professionals Follow-Up Study. What are the inherent issues with that? Or better yet, what are the inherent issues with the Lyon Diet Heart Study, long-term RCT? Can you point out specific issues with either of those? Like methods.
That's not really the point. The point is that there's countervailing arguments or countervailing evidence.
There's countervailing evidence for smoking too.
None of these studies are perfect.
No, I'm not saying they are.
I'm not have flaws.
I'm wondering, I want to know what those flaws are, because here's the thing. Those flaws need to ultimately apply to the studies I'm providing, but not to the studies that you're providing in order to demonstrate
No,
that
I'm
your
not saying
studies
that
are
at
better.
all. See, the thing is that I haven't said that ever.
No,
I've
I'm not saying
actually disparagingly towards the studies on
Yeah,
my side as
I'm
well.
not I'm
That
not
they're not
saying
perfect, they're not good, and so that's why I said we shouldn't be looking at those studies. We should be going to first principles. What are we biologically designed to eat?
no, but see, I'm arguing. So again, we're going back to you just acknowledged that what you care about are the outcomes, right? You said that that is the be all end all based on that hypothetical. That's what I care about too. I care about the people dying every day from cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so on. I don't care whether or not we have an adaptation to extract nutrition from a given food, right? I care about, at the end of the day, is this going to help people prevent, falling on their face from a heart attack? That's what I care about, and I've provided evidence showing that that swap from red meat to plant protein is a beneficial one, and I haven't seen any argument against the data I've provided. That's what I want to know. Is there any flaw? Like, I've seen you say, and I can pull up the exact timestamp if you want, but I've seen you say you have to look at the methods of these studies to critique them. And if you want, I will pull that up. It's totally up to you.
I know what I said.
Yeah. So I'm asking you just to do that, right? To just critique methodologically. Surely you're familiar with, like I said, the Nurses Health Professionals follow-up. Surely you're familiar with Lyon Diet Heart, some of the most famous nutrition studies we have out there. So what are the issues with at least those? I'm not expecting you to go into everything I've presented.
Well, that's the thing. I didn't prepare for that. I haven't gone through those at the moment, so I couldn't give you a robust description of that. The thing is, we're disagreeing on the premise here.
No,
You're talking about a false premise. You're saying
I'm not. See, that's
things,
No, I'm not. You're assuming that the adaptations lead to the outcome, but we've already established what you care about is the outcome. I also do. I don't agree that the adaptation leads to the outcome, and I'm providing counter evidence.
Why is that? What is your biological premise for that?
Because the health outcome data clearly shows us that this approach is better long term.
But there's plenty of other health outcome data that shows the opposite.
And in fact, I just want to point out something really quick here. If we go to this, because this is your lecture, right? So this is your lecture from Plants Are Trying to Kill You. If we go down to the references, we see, there's like podcasts, there's some YouTube videos and stuff, but here you say fiber causes colon disease. But when we open it up, it's a cross-sectional study of 2,000 people. Like, why are you using that sort of terminology for really low-quality observational research when you're discounting some of the, the Nurses Health Professionals follow-up, long-term RCTs, without actually providing a critique?
So, I'm using loose language. I can certainly change that because you're right. That wasn't a causative study.
Okay, I think that's a good idea.
That doesn't really change the fact that there was, 2,000 people that found that the only correlation between diverticulosis was increased levels of diverticulosis was increased fiber intake and increased bowel motions per week.
And it was cross-sectional, right? So it was a snapshot in time. It could be the case that people eating more fiber, people with diverticulosis were eating more fiber to try to treat that. In fact, we have a meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies where you look at fiber intake pre-diverticulosis, and fiber intake actually lowers risk of developing it. So that would be stronger evidence.
Yeah.
I don't know
why they would go on. I don't know why they would go on.
Because it's a common recommendation.
A high fiber diet.
It's a common recommendation.
No, it's actually not. It's actually the exact opposite. When I was doing general surgery,
for
recommendation was to go on a low residue diet.
For diverticulitis or for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's, yes. For diverticulosis.
And to protect.
That's not true.
They said stay away from seeds and fiber. I'm just telling you from my practice in my hospital. That is absolutely the recommendation.
But just going back to the whole point of that, it's like you're citing observational. You're claiming. You're correcting yourself. You wouldn't call it causal. That's great. But I still have not heard a critique for any of the data I've presented, and these are very popular. Surely you come across them all the time. You cited the UK Biobank, which actually showed a reduction in all-cause mortality with higher vegetable intake, despite claiming it was no effect. I mean, you were talking about cardiovascular.
No, I didn't.
Kind of. Well, you said no effect on cardiovascular disease, which was sure, but it's just weird to cite that, but not the all-cause mortality result. But at the end of the day, I have not heard a critique, but what I need to hear ultimately is a critique for any of the research I
Well,
presented.
I told you, if you want to do a critique sometime, we can go through it. I'm not prepared to do a critique at this point in time. I didn't receive your studies or anything like that. I couldn't go through them, and so I don't have a critique.
Yeah, and
So
that
I'm
was
prepared
obviously
for the
Lauren
debate
was
at
away,
hand.
so that explains that.
Yeah,
But
that's
anyways,
fine. But the thing is that you're asking me to do something that I'm not prepared for, and so obviously that's not something that I can do in a well-reasoned way. The point is that there are other studies. There are studies that go counter to what you're saying. There are studies that suggest that that vegetarians are even less healthy and have a low quality life than meat eaters. There's a study with 100.
Can you cite one, please?
No? Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask you guys both a question as well?
Yeah,
that I'm genuinely just curious about.
Yeah.
Dr. Nagra, have you ever tried a carnivore-based diet?
No.
Dr.
I mean, I've eaten a meat-heavy diet, but no, I haven't eaten a carnivore diet specifically.
Okay. And Dr. Chaffee, have you ever tried a vegan-based diet?
I was eating mostly plants before I went carnivore, yeah. And whole food plants, like a lot of spinach and kale and broccoli. Never eat processed foods or sugars or carbs, ever. Never ate any of that sort of stuff.
Okay, did you have a lot of meat? Like, I don't know, 100% of your diet?
No, not much. No, I limited it. So when I was in Bangladesh doing humanitarian work, it really just wasn't available. There wasn't really much food available, and so I ate what was available. And then when I got back, I was mostly plant-based, just eating predominantly greens like spinach and kale and broccoli. And I would eat some meat, very lean meat, and low amounts of it. And I was doing that for a couple months. Didn't feel great at all. And then when I switched and got rid of the plants and started eating more meat and more fatty meat, my health radically changed. And so that's when I got interested in this and started looking more in depth to that. But I've never eaten a processed food diet ever. I was a professional athlete for a number of years. I was always very careful about what went in my body, and that's what I see as well. You certainly see the people going from a processed food diet to this and improving, but you also see people that have been long-term vegans for a while, short or long-term, and having serious health detriment. There's like something like 84% of vegans and vegetarians.
That's not true. That's actually not. No, that's based on Funalytics.
Maybe you can.
Yeah.
Well, so that. Let me finish my thought.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
You can go on.
Yeah. Go ahead.
But and that's fine, because the thing is that I haven't really crunched those statistics. Those are just statistics that I've
seen. It's cited often.
So I'm not. Yeah. Exactly. And so that's the thing. It's just. But either way, there was that statistic that says 84%. Was a survey based, and they said, basically asked what your main reason for quitting a vegan vegetarian diet was, and the most common response was their health had suffered.
That's not true.
And so, that was in that study.
In the Funalytics, it was not.
Survey?
No, it was not in the. Yeah. So it was
enough.
actually.
So that's fine.
Go ahead.
But either way, what I'm seeing is not a bunch of people leaving a processed food diet and improving. I'm certainly seeing that, but I'm also seeing people leaving a whole food plant-based diet and improving when they start adding back in meat. Not even if they go full carnivore, but just adding back in meat significantly helps their health, especially with autoimmune issues. Those can be dramatically improved by getting rid of anything except meat. And I've seen people with Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, rheumatoid arthritis, MS. SLE put these things into remission. Hashimoto's, I have dozens of Hashimoto's patients. They all improve going on a meat-only diet, and a lot of them were plant-based. And so I don't think that it's just getting away from processed foods. There is a benefit to eating meat, and seemingly from reducing other things. And we can get into that when we talk about the whole, plants are trying to kill you thing. But you were going to say.
Yeah. So, look, we can look at anecdotes on either side. I mean, we see Paul Saladino started introducing plants after he didn't feel so good. Frank Tufano's off the carnivore diet and disparages the carnivore diet at this point. We have the carnivore kid. He had a scan, found out he had a lot of coronary artery blockage. I can't remember the exact percentage. You look at, for anybody watching this, go to Carnivore Cringe on Instagram and just look through all the posts of people struggling on the carnivore diet. Anecdotes are unreliable. We can point in any direction we want. We can look at Mark Hubb, the researcher from Kansas State University, went on the Twinkie diet. It was Twinkie and sweets, basically, like 80% of his diet. Lost weight, improved biomarkers, felt better. Of course, weight loss is going to help. And it's an elimination diet, just like a carnivore diet could be as well, and just like a plant-based diet could be as well, in either direction. These anecdotes don't tell us a lot. You can't control for other variables. You can't adjust for them properly. That's why looking at prospective cohorts that are well adjusted, like a couple that I've mentioned so far, are beneficial. Now, I do want to just mention, you said you were bringing up a study about vegetarians doing worse. I was wondering if you can bring that up.
Yep.
Or send it in the chat. Maybe I can pop it open on my end too. Actually, another anecdote that's always a funny one is Freddie Blum was like the oldest person in the world. He actually died a few years ago at like 120 or something. But he smoked every day. It's like you can find anecdotes for anything. So just not super reliable and don't really tell us much about how they would have been without it.
I'm not talking about individual anecdotes. I'm talking about hundreds of my patients and thousands of people.
I mean, I could say the same thing, right?
Well, I agree with you.
Yeah.
That you can improve your health in other ways. I'm not saying the only way is a carnivore diet, but I do think that meat is a very important part of a healthy diet. First and foremost, because you're getting adequate nutrition and you're not reliant on supplements, but also because you're eliminating out because you're eating that, you're getting in calories that are sort of working out other things that maybe aren't so good for you. You're getting very bioavailable protein in perfect proportions, right? So egg is considered a perfect protein because it has all the aminos you need in the right proportions, and that's also very important. And you're also getting fatty acids, which are important. We have essential fatty acids that you have to get that are very difficult to
like
get
alpha-linolenic
from
and linoleic.
Yeah, well, so ALA, I know in Simon Hill's book, he talks about how you can convert ALA into DHA and EPA, but there are plenty of people like Professor Robert Lustig who says, no, you actually can't do that. And so I mean, that's not something I'm wholly versed in, but I'm just to say that there are disagreements in the literature that none of this is like, well, this is the definitive.
Yeah, I don't think we have the perfect study on EPA DHA. I will grant that. I don't think we have the perfect study on EPA DHA, at least in populations that don't consume them yet. But while you're popping that study up, maybe if I just mention K2 and vitamin A quick, because you'd mentioned those. So yeah, for vitamin K2, are you familiar with the different types, MK7, MK4?
No, not particularly.
Okay,
no.
okay. So MK7 is so we produce both of these in our body. We convert K1. Also, the microbes in our gut produce some. So MK4 is the predominant type in animal foods, in meat, in cheeses, and whatnot. And we actually don't absorb it at dietary doses. So let's pop this open here. So at the types of doses we use in our diet, or that we would get in our diet, even consuming a fair amount, we have the MK4 at 420 micrograms, we have MK7 at 420 micrograms. The MK4 that is present in food does not contribute to vitamin K status. It didn't actually increase blood levels. And in order to absorb it, we need very, very high doses that are achieved pretty much exclusively through supplementation. MK7, on the other hand, is the type we find in natto, which is fermented soy, and we can actually absorb it from there. Now, it's not an essential nutrient because we do convert K1. Like I said, the microbes in our gut produce some K2 as well. But this idea that we're getting K2 from meat just doesn't follow because we don't even absorb it at those doses. Now, on top of that, just talking about vitamin A really quick. So we look at the conversion of beta carotene to vitamin A. It's just taking a minute to load. We find that, where is it? There's a good figure in here that breaks them all down. Jesus, I don't know why it's so slow. It's slow because I got like a million things running right now, probably. Okay, so if we look at like fruits, green vegetables, let's take sweet potatoes. They're kind of right in the middle. In fact, I will take the most conservative estimate of a 13-to-1 conversion ratio. The conversion can range from about 1 to I think it's 3 or so to like a 1 to 27 roughly. But if we do it'd be a 3 to 1 to like a 27 to 1. If we go with a 13-to-1 ratio, if you have 60% impairment, so most people who have impaired vitamin A synthesis or beta carotene conversion, they have about a 55 to 70% impairment of conversion. To make enough vitamin A, all you'd have to do, if you had 60% impairment, let's say, is to eat literally 1 cup of mashed sweet potatoes in a day. Forget about all the other food you ate, and you've got enough vitamin A. If you had 80%, 70%, being extra generous, we're talking about, it was 80%. Sorry, I did the math a little while ago. If you had 80% conversion or impairment of conversion, you're talking about 2 cups of sweet potatoes in a day to meet your needs. It's nothing. It's so easy. And this goes back to the data I showed earlier, looking at actual tissue levels and deficiency rates of these nutrients. We don't see higher rates of vitamin A deficiency amongst vegans. And if there was this crazy issue with us converting enough carotenoids, surely we would see huge deficiency rates, but we don't. So it just doesn't make any sense to make that claim. So K2
aren't those things looking at supplementation as well?
No, so
in those things you're talking about, that when everyone had a pretty adequate nutritional status, those were all in people that were supplementing.
For
that
B12,
was your point.
For like B12 and fortified foods through B12, sure.
So, but did that study only look at supplementation with B12 and then no other supplements?
No, that particular study didn't. However, even if we look at people who have impairment, and I'll pull up another study if we want to go through it, where people actually have impairment and they're consuming vitamin A from various food sources, plant food sources with very little preformed, when they're consuming beta carotene with very little preformed vitamin A, we see that it actually improves their vitamin A status. And I'm not aware of any evidence of vitamin A deficiency amongst vegans, or at a higher rate at least than we see in omnivorous populations. Unless you have, I'd like to see that. But I'm still obviously waiting for that other study you had mentioned as well.
Yeah, but in those cases, you're looking at vegetarian, vegan populations that are not supplementing and they have normal vitamin A. Is that what you're saying?
No, so I'm looking at vegans and vegetarians in the general population. Vitamin A supplementation rates generally aren't super high, but I'm not aware of any studies on vegan or vegetarian populations being vitamin A deficient regardless. Mm-hmm. And this goes back to we can look at we can look back
that's
at
fine. I don't know of any specific ones to that degree as well. It's just pointing out that retinol doesn't exist in plants, and some people are hyper-responders.
Yeah, and even in that case, right? Like I said, a cup of sweet potatoes for a 70% impairment, to 2 cups for a 80% impairment. No problem.
The problem is too is that many of these plant-based foods, they're all fortified with vitamin A and vitamin D and all of these things as well. So it's hard to say if you're looking at a general population.
We have
most
trials.
People are eating fortified foods.
No. We have studies of actually feeding beta carotene and improving status. We have studies in like children in India, for example. Yeah, and you feed beta carotene and they improve their vitamin A status. So.
I don't doubt for a second that you can do that. I'm just saying that when you get people and that are hypo responders, that are hypo metabolizers of it, that they can run into problems. I'm not saying you can't get vitamin A
if you're eating
from
carotene, basically, like if you're eating little to no beta carotene, like I said, it doesn't take much. If you exclude the rest of the diet, a cup of sweet potatoes in someone with 60% impairment, 2 cups in someone with 80% impairment. Those are like 80%, especially, is beyond even what typically people who can't synthesize vitamin A you would see. Normally it's around the 55 to 70% mark, and so it really doesn't take much. That's the problem. Is that so unless just a question.
In Western countries.
Sure.
And when we're in Western countries and we know that, we read a book, but if someone's in India or they're in a rural area, they don't know that and they don't necessarily have access to sweet potatoes. That might be a bit more of an issue.
There's other plant foods too, right? It's not just sweet potatoes, and I'm not talking about that, right? I'm talking about people who are going to be watching this podcast, presumably more in Canada, U.S., Australia, etc. For them, it's just not a problem, unless you're eating an incredibly restrictive diet, which obviously I would never advocate.
I'll just agree with you there. I totally agree with you.
Okay.
My point in saying that was just that I was just pointing out there are other nutritional deficiencies and other sort of problems, and you're pointing out that vitamin A probably isn't one of them. Fine.
Yeah, neither is K2. I would say. Neither is K2, especially if you're. Okay. Well, no. Again, do you have evidence of absorption at dietary doses of K2 from animal foods? It just doesn't happen.
There are studies in nutritional dentistry that have pointed out specifically that dentition is severely affected by a lack of dietary K2.
And they adjust for other factors versus just the foods that K2 are found in, or yeah. So I mean, again, I just like to see that. You know, if you can show. I mean, we're still waiting for that.
Again,
I want to zoom out.
Here's the thing: is these are.
I want to zoom out really quickly because people that are listening to this, they don't know the specific nuances that y'all know, of the specific details of each little thing. They don't know, and frankly, they're not going to know. They're not going to know, you know, and that's just the realistic approach. So it sounds, you know, there's a lot of little things in there that are relevant. They're so relevant, you know, that there is a space for them to be discussed. But ultimately, it kind of sounds like the general kind of layout of this is that, Dr. Chaffee, you think that if a diet that somebody needs to eat needs to be supplemented, let's say with B12 or something else, how could that be correct? And what you're asserting, Dr. Nagra, is that it doesn't actually necessarily need to be supplemented very much. It's really all pretty much there, and you can find it.
No, I want to clarify. That's not what I'm saying. I think there are certain nutrients like B12, for example, depending on where you live. Vitamin D. I live in Canada. Of course, we don't get a lot of sunshine. Right. I think everyone here should probably be taking that. Yeah, I mean, really, it was sunny the last couple days, but basically, there are certain nutrients. I think stretching into K2, vitamin A, I don't think there's any good evidence for that, and carnitine as well, non-essential, and supplementation's actually been shown to lead to some carotid stenosis. People with genetically higher L-carnitine tend to have higher risk of cardiovascular disease as well, based on some Mendelian randomization, so like looking at genetic levels. So I'd be concerned about supplementing with L-carnitine. But anyways, the point that I was making is that whether or not you need supplementation doesn't have a bearing on whether or not a diet is necessarily healthy. And what I care about are health outcomes. Is it going to lead to a heart attack? Is it going to lead to a stroke, cancer, etc.? It seemed like, you know, when we did the hypothetical, eventually we got agreement on that topic, the outcomes mattering the most. And yeah, I think there are certain supplements that are needed, and I don't see a problem with that.
Okay, so I want to move on to the next question. I want to ask you guys both a follow-up question on that because I don't understand.
Okay.
And I want to understand.
Go ahead.
I don't see how a diet could exist if it doesn't have the nutrients necessary for one to get to a healthy life. If you need supplements, then you can't live, meaning you can't avoid cardiovascular disease, you can't avoid cancer, and so on and so forth. So my confusion with that is not to disagree with you. It's genuinely that from my position, and I think from a lot of people who eat a carnivore-based lifestyle, the question is, well, if it needs supplements and you don't have access to supplements, then you'll die. So this concept of having a healthier life doesn't matter because you're not living.
So I mean, I think it's just worded a bit awkwardly, but I'll try to address that. So in a context where you have no access to supplementation or what have you, or fortified foods, like might be the case in some impoverished areas, yeah, I think that is problematic. I think in those cases, including some animal foods may actually be better insofar that it provides you with certain nutrients that you might not get otherwise, like B12. However, in a context where that is available to you, you're able to have fortified foods like I'm just assuming a lot of, at least my fan base, so to speak, who would be watching this largely in U.S. and Canada, that they would have access to that. They'd be able to consume fortified foods. And when we look on a population level of people consuming these diets, whether that's with fortified foods or supplementation, we see that they do just fine as far as supplements, or as far as nutrient status, rather. So I don't see why that matters. In fact, even Anthony had agreed earlier that some people may need to supplement folate, for example, or at least worry about their intake and focus on specific foods for that if they have MTHFR variation or something, right? Like so there are cases on either side where that is something to be concerned about, but I don't see how that has bearing on health outcomes, provided that you have access to it. Like B12, look, I pay $14 a year for my supplement. It's the once weekly high dose. Easy. It really doesn't have to be that much.
It's interesting that, I guess the question I would have, Dr. Nagra, is do you feel that based off of what you just expressed, is the diet that you're eating a vegan diet for those that are of the means, or is it for all of humanity? You know what I mean? Like, is it for everyone, or is it for those that have the means?
I don't think any diet is necessarily for. I don't think every carnivore diet is for everyone either. I mean, there are people who live in places that literally rely on more plant foods and what they could grow locally. There's populations. I think I've seen you, Anthony, mention this. You know, people in Papua New Guinea who live on sweet potatoes largely, or So
Yeah.
I don't think you can say that about any diet.
And do very well.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the thing is I don't think you can say that, but that's not necessarily who we're reaching here, right? I try to speak to those who we are reaching, those who have the choice. I think there's a major issue with the food system in that there are food deserts. There are issues with pricing of generally healthier foods, and I would throw these plant foods as well as some animal products into that ballpark over things like Oreo cookies and sugar sweetened beverages. And so there needs to be a food system shift to help subsidize healthier foods. Of course, my position on that would be more of the like fruits and veggies and whatnot. We might have disagreements there, but I think that we would hopefully agree that there needs to be a larger shift at a higher level than just telling people what to eat, because not everybody has the means to do either of what we're recommending here.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's a point of common ground. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And look, I don't think that we're, Dr. Baker said that he thinks that humans are really facultative carnivores, that we can eat an omnivorous diet, but we do well or better, with more meat. It is very true that people for a long time have done very well and had long, good, healthy lives eating a mixed diet, and that's fine, especially in areas that you don't have access to these other sort of things. I mean, that's really what is thought, that we did start switching over to plant foods, post agricultural revolution, or because during the agricultural revolution, is because megafauna died out for one reason or another, and we didn't really have access to these things. Some places did, like the Native Americans in North America. They like the Plains Indians, they just ate buffalo. There's 100 million people that were supported on that sort of hunter-gatherer, but really hunter lifestyle. There was a study too that showed that they were, in the 1800s, they were the largest or tallest population on Earth. And typically, an average height of a population denotes the average health of a population. Now they are not. They have since shrunk down. They are much shorter now, and that's pretty quick. So that's about 150 years, since that changed, and their health has suffered tremendously as well. Now they have gone to the standard processed food, alcohol, sugar sort of diets, and no one here is arguing that that's a good idea. But it is just to say that they ate predominantly meat and did very, very well. There are other places that ate a mixture and did very, very well. There's other places like Papua New Guinea that ate a lot of plants, a lot of these yam, like 60 different kinds of yams. Do very well. And they eliminate, there's commonalities there, and Dr. Kenobi thinks that that's the commonality there, is that they've reduced their omega-6 down to 1% to 2%, and all these different populations that are all doing pretty well, very lean and healthy and low rates of disease, they all have that 1% to 2% omega-6 ratio. So it's an interesting theory, but there is commonality here, in a lot of diets. The reason that I made the video, and this may be a good segue onto this, and might for time's sake maybe do this part and touch on some other things if you guys want, but really just go on the reason I did the video, Plants Are Trying to Kill You, and the reason I called it that was to call attention. It's a funny anecdote of when I was in, but it's also just a funny anecdote from when I was in college, and it's something that resonated with me. I've said before, I don't think that plants have something out against us and they want to get us. It's just that they are living organisms, and they have to defend themselves, and they want to defend themselves, and they will defend themselves, and that we can eat plants. But being told that you can indiscriminately just eat a lot of plants, I think that's dangerous, and that's why I made the point with the WHO study or paper or article, but so many others, that these things do exist. And if you don't pay attention to them, you can run into problems. And I've got a number of different studies to illustrate that. One of your critiques with Simon was that I ignored the fact that the WHO said, well, with a well-balanced, well-established diet, that you don't really see these things in dangerous numbers. But it goes on to say, if you don't do that, if these things get out of balance, you can go to the hospital or die. And so, I wasn't ignoring that. I was pointing out that these things exist, and you can't just ignore them. You can't just say, well, I'm sure it'll be fine. If I buy it at the grocery store, it's okay. Because it's not necessarily. And like I said earlier, there are traditional methods of cooking and preparing these foods that detoxify them, which again illustrates the point that we're not designed to eat them because we don't have the inherent capacity to detoxify them and extract their nutrients. But if people are unaware of that, let's take the case of kidney beans. I have a number of different studies I can pull up on this, showing that in different areas, dozens or hundreds of people over a certain period of time, when they didn't cook or prepare red kidney beans properly, like in the UK, they were hospitalized. They had severe issues. There was a case or a time in Japan where they had there was like some recipe on television or something like that on how to cook some like white beans or something like that. It was incorrect, and about 1,000 people went to the hospital because they didn't prepare these things properly. It's not to say that you can't have a plant-based diet or include plants in your diet and be healthy relatively. It's that if you just indiscriminately just say, can't possibly hurt us in these numbers, and so I'll just eat whatever plants I want, I think that you're rolling the dice there, and I think that you can end up creating harm, and that you can hurt yourself. The idea that plants are
I want to chime in on that too, not to interrupt you, but just to catch the listeners up. We're now at the question of, are plants trying to kill you? Is this something? Are they actually trying to attack us? So please continue. I just wanted to make sure everybody was on.
Yeah, I figured we're already there. Yeah.
But that's the thing. It's just to illustrate the premise that plants do defend themselves by chemical means. And this is, the idea of inedible plants. We know this can really cause harm, but that doesn't mean that these other plants are completely benign, because those plants to other animals are not benign. They can harm them quite significantly. This is why you have to be careful about the different sorts of plant-sourced foods that your dog or cat would get its hands on, because they can get very sick from that as well, because they don't have the ability to detoxify these things as well as we do. So that was why I did that, was just to point that out. I wasn't trying to say anything more than that. I was just trying to say, look, there are these toxins that exist. We know this in animal husbandry. You have an animal that eats certain things, they get very harmed by this, and there are multiple resources showing that. I can go through some if you want. I can also.
I'm assuming the WHO and the New Zealand, like those.
WHO, but many others as well. Let me see here.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll go through some of the ones because we wanted to you wanted to see some of the ones that I was referencing, so I want to bring those up as well.
Yeah, if they're the ones that are linked on your video, I've seen them, but up to you.
Should we do this quick where you made your position about the plants, and then maybe Dr. Nagra, you share your position on that, and then we go back to what you wanted to share, Dr. Chaffee?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'm just going to share the whole screen here. You can see this now. So this was something published in the International Journal of General Medicine. It was a study out of Australia. They looked at 175 different populations, countries, and territories, accounting for around 90% of the world, and it found that correcting for socioeconomic factors, that meat was a positive factor on life expectancy. So that was a positive. Just showing here, there's this sort of a headline. I'll show you the study. Vegetarians are less healthy and have lower quality of life than meat eaters. This was a cross-sectional analysis of 1,300 people looking at 4 different dietary regimes, and they found that our results revealed that vegetarian diet is related to lower BMI and less frequent alcohol consumption. Moreover, our results showed that a vegetarian diet is associated with poorer health, higher incidence of cancer, allergies, and mental health disorders, a higher need for healthcare, and poorer quality of life. So that's just to illustrate, again, there are no perfect studies. That is just to illustrate the fact that there is contention in the literature as well. I'll try and bring up the...
So this is a lot to address. Can I pause, and then we can go back and forth on this after?
The thing was, I was just trying to, because we had talked about it before. All I wanted to do was just show you that those existed.
Because I do want to respond to these two, but I want to respond to the plant toxin topic as well. So it's just
Which one would you like to do first? Do you want to talk about that first? Or?
So should I do the plant toxin part first, or should I respond to these first?
Maybe just do that, because I was still going to show you a couple things on the plant toxins.
Sorry, do the plant toxins first, or these things first? The ones you just mentioned.
These things.
Okay. So for the protein digestibility part, assuming was that measured with the DAS or the PDCAS as far as digestibility? Do you know?
No, let me look that up. Sorry.
Yeah, it'll be probably one of those two.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So as far as the it's most likely one of those two, unless you say otherwise. I'll assume it's one of those two scoring systems, because those are the most often used. So they are basically based on feeding individual foods to typically rodents or pigs, seeing how much goes in one end, how much comes out the other end, as far as the protein, and presumably you've absorbed the amount that is the difference. With pigs, it's up until the end of the small intestine, or with the DAS rather, it's up until the end of the small intestine. They then actually modify the scores based on what amino acid is present in the lowest amount. And now, if you're eating a single food diet, I would say yes, that's a problem. But if you're eating a variety of foods, or you're exceeding your protein needs, at least as far as the RDA, I do suggest higher though, then that is no longer a problem. It compensates. But more than any of that, what we ultimately need to look at are outcomes. So what actually happens when you pit vegans against meat eaters and you equate their protein intake? So there was a study done in Brazil in it was published in 2021. This is Hevia Lorraine is the author. The senior author was Hamilton Rochelle, and published in the journal SportsMed. And they found that when both groups are eating 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, and they're performing resistance training, you get the same results at the end of the day, same muscle and strength gains. So there are clearly issues with using those measures of digestibility, or really any measure of digestibility if it was something else, because the outcomes are the same. What I care about is, do you get the same result? There was also a more recent study. This one was looking at mycoprotein. In particular, so this is, actually I guess I could share my screen for this. I should have done that. So looking at mycoprotein specifically, this is just from a presentation I've given before. Looking at mycoprotein specifically, so these are in certain like plant-based meat alternative products, primarily in the UK and US, and they had them eat either most of their protein from the mycoprotein, or most of their protein from animal protein sources, upping it to above that 1.6 grams per kilogram per day. And again, they got the same result at the end of resistance training 5 times a week for 10 weeks. And these were people with a history of training too. They weren't untrained individuals in this particular study. So whether or not there's differences on certain measures as far as digestibility or whatever, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you're eating enough protein and matching intake. Now, as far as the total meat intake and across countries, that cross-sectional study, there are some major issues with that. So I'm just going to pull up something here as well. So it was cross-sectional for starters. That's one issue. And they didn't actually look at dietary intake. Are you familiar with how they tracked meat intake?
I'd have to look at it, but no, go on.
Yeah, so they actually didn't track meat intake. They tracked food, like meat supply data from each country, and didn't even use the loss-adjusted numbers, which is bizarre. You should at least use that. So that's one problem. It's not a very good, and I know you said it's not a great study anyway, but I'm just saying it's actually much poorer than the data I've cited on meat intake in particular, where you're tracking it at the individual level. Secondly, they didn't really adjust for socioeconomic status. They actually adjusted for GDP, which can bias the results because during times of rapid growth, mortality can increase, for example. So that's one issue with using GDP. And secondly, it doesn't tell us what proportions of the populations are of higher socioeconomic status or not within each population. It could be the case that everyone is on a very similar ground or level of income within one population who has the same GDP as another population, where a lot of people are way up here and others are way down here. It's a very kind of gross estimate of that. And if we look at, say, smoking rates across populations, per capita cigarette consumption, I'll just pull it up. Per capita cigarette consumption across populations and life expectancy suggests that countries with higher cigarette consumption actually have greater life expectancy too. That's why it's bizarre to do these cross-country analyses. What is far better is looking within populations, different levels of meat intake, and seeing if those who eat more have a higher or lower risk of things like mortality than those who eat less, while adjusting for confounding variables. The reason I like the nurses' health study and health professionals' follow-up study in particular so much is because you're comparing nurses to nurses, doctors to doctors, and you're adjusting for smoking, physical activity, BMI, and the areas that they live in, I believe, is one of them, and just on and on and on. One of the more comprehensive adjustment models that we have. And they repeat dietary intakes, which is awesome. Every 4 years they collect diet data versus a lot of studies where they only collect it once and then they don't later on. And now that last study, the one on you mentioned it was a cross-sectional study of vegetarians. Again, cross-sectional is definitely much lower on the evidence hierarchy related to actually seeing a temporal component. But what's funny is I didn't catch all the outcomes there. I mean, if you send it to me, I'm happy to look at it in more depth, maybe in the chat or something, or perhaps if we were to do another discussion. But looking at mental health, for example, when you actually stratified by semi-vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian, vegan, vegans actually aren't at higher risk, or vegan diets aren't associated with significant increase in risk of like depression or anxiety. If anything, there might even be a slight decrease. Where we see it is with the semi-vegetarians, which to me suggests that it may be a matter of motivation. Like it might be the case that people who are adopting a semi-veg diet might be doing it more for physique, for other markers that might be associated with disordered eating patterns and mental health concerns, and it's just really hard to tell based on that sort of cross-sectional data. So those would be my responses to those, and then if you want me to go into the plant toxin talk, I can, or if you want to bring up the rest of the stuff you were going to bring up, feel free. We're just kind of jumping around a little bit.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So I'll just I'll just bring up a couple points, and then feel free to mention what you would like about that talk, and we can go from there. Let me see here. Okay. You just need to do entire screen here. It's a bit easier.
Actually, that would probably be easier. Didn't even think of that.
Yeah. So I've taken out a number of these clips from various studies and various sources to illustrate different sorts of points of plant toxicity in the foods that we are eating.
Can you provide the specific studies as well, just versus the clips? It's hard to see where that's from.
Yeah, so they're all out of these two. So this is the white kidney bean incidence that I was discussing. So it was a TV program in 2006 where they're introducing a new diet and a staple food, and they found that viewers that tried to follow this, that 1,000 of them were actually poisoned, had acute intestinal symptoms, and 100 people were hospitalized. And they attribute that to the lectins in the white kidney beans were suspected to be the cause of the trouble. This is another, it's from a clip from another one that just talks about the various different areas around the world where you have these poisonings, acute poisonings, 13 children that were hospitalized in Czech Republic from eating runner beans and French beans, and in Switzerland they had a number of these different plants that were the poisons from these plants were found to cause severe poisoning during that period of time. And it goes on. It mentions the Japanese study in China, 124 health incidents affecting 7,526 individuals related to fresh kidney beans were reported in a 9-year span. And Denmark goes on to discuss similar sorts of issues. So there are different, this is USDA.gov, and so looking at the International Journal of Poisonous Plant Research, and this is going into animal husbandry and the different sorts of plants that are harmful. So poisonous plant research. So that's just illustrating that in the field of toxicology and botany and animal husbandry, that this is actually a well-known phenomenon, and just indiscriminately eating plants can lead to trouble. And so again, it's not that you can never eat plants, it's just that you need to know what you're doing, and you can't just indiscriminately do it and just say, well, all plants should be fine in the levels that we're eating it, because what levels are we eating it? Some people are eating it in doses that are not acceptable. A good example of that is oxalates. I know that you've spoken about oxalates before, but there are some pieces of information that suggest that as much as or as little as 5,000 grams of oxalates can be extremely detrimental to health. There's more often 10,000 to 15,000 milligrams.
What do you mean by extremely detrimental, just so I'm clear?
Oh, death. It caused death. So there's case studies where people died.
In like dietary doses?
Yeah.
Like typical dietary doses.
At that 5,000 milligrams.
I mean,
the thing is that you can't just indiscriminately do that.
Yeah.
So in 100 milligrams of spinach, there's anywhere from 300 to 1,200 milligrams of oxalates. I'm seeing 1/2 a cup of cooked or 1 cup raw, about 650 average. So I mean, you're talking about I don't think anyone's recommending that much spinach. That's an insane amount. But that's my point. Is that you do need to be clear. You have to draw a line. I think we agree that this is that you can't just indiscriminately eat plants, right? And
you can't do that for anything. You can't do that for meat either, or animal products either.
But I don't think there's anything directly toxic in meat.
Slow lories, blue crab frit, common quail, garter snake, American toad, Azaic toad, cane toad, Colorado river toad, common toad, Fowler's toad, poison and dart frog, Pacific newts,
and toxins,
of course, blister beetle,
and toxic skin, and all that sort of stuff.
Well, there's things that you can't just indiscriminately eat animals either, right? And we understand that.
Look, you're right. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that you can eat any poisonous animal or toad or anything like that. Certainly not. But the meat that we buy in supermarkets, say, I don't know of any poisonous animal that's sold there. And I can reply to that when you have the chance. So are you pulling something else up? Yeah, so I'm pulling up. So this is a table of the different oxalate content in different plants, and so rhubarb and spinach obviously having high numbers of these sorts of things, but other things as well. And that's per 100 grams. And
that's a lot.
Sure. Yeah.
Like you'd have to eat an insane amount to run into any issues.
As
far as the issues that you've mentioned.
Milligrams. Yeah. Well, look, it happens, and there are case reports of people going to the hospital or dying
of oxalate poisoning from spinach. Look, if they're consuming,
that's another one, a rhubarb. Yeah.
Well, if they're consuming that amount, then clearly they need some education on that, and I would agree with that.
Yeah, but okay, so that's my point, is that you do need to tell people, hey, it's safe to eat to this point. Right now, no one's doing that, and I haven't heard anybody do that. And that's the purpose of making the plants are trying to kill you thing, is to point out that these things have something in there. Not that you can never include them in your diet, but that you do need to be aware there is an upper limit there, and that you can be harmed if you exceed it.
So, but then are you accepting that let's say someone's eating a cup of spinach, they're having some properly cooked beans and so on in a day, that can actually be a really healthy option based on the health outcome data we have, of course, right? That seems like it's what you're saying, right?
Well, I think it can be, you can have it in a more safe way if it's under a certain threshold, and depending on where you go and you look at that, different sources say that you want to stay below 100 to 150 milligrams per day, and with
150 milligrams of sorry, what? 150 milligrams
oxalates.
Of oxalate, but you said it was like 5,000 plus or 50,000
is
plus or something.
the is the fatal dose.
Yeah.
Dose,
So,
yeah.
but do you have
Yeah, but
evidence
you
of
can
harm
get harm long before there's a fatal dose, right?
But do you have evidence of harm at that 150 milligrams a day?
Yeah, so there are, well, there's just a number of different sources, and that's their arbitrary line that they're saying 100 to 150, and then after that, if you're doing that perpetually, that
Can you
bring
show
about
that though? Right. That's my question: is can you actually show that that's the case? Like, can you provide some evidence showing that actually leads to worse outcomes? Not just someone saying so, but like that actually leads to a worse outcome.
Well, there's studies looking at kidney stones and nephrotoxicity
And
above
yeah,
that level.
can you bring those up at that level, particularly with adequate calcium intake? Because I've seen it in cases where calcium intake is in the gutter, but above, like we look at the Nurses' Health study, above about 500 milligrams of, or was it 5 or maybe 700 milligrams of calcium a day, oxalates were not associated with kidney stone risk.
Yeah, no, so I agree with you there,
Yeah.
that if you add in adequate calcium, that can temper that. But it is just to illustrate that these things can cause harm. There are also studies that illustrate that if you supplement
can you just show that? But before we keep going, can you actually just show the studies? I've never seen something at that low of an intake suggesting that it causes stones or nephrotoxicity in humans.
Yeah, 1 second.
I also think that
I was gonna say, meanwhile, while you're looking it up, I can respond to some of the lectin stuff, perhaps, or whatever.
Yeah, I was going to say, for the sake of time, why don't we do this? Why don't Dr. Chaffee, you pull those up, and then Dr. Nagra, you respond, absolutely, and then we'll wrap it up after that.
Yeah, and Anthony, can you just unshare so I can share in the meantime while you're looking that up? Yeah. Okay. So just talking about this idea of lectins and plant toxins and so on. Obviously, I listed off there are poisonous animals, and if you want to talk about the ones that we see in the grocery store, I'll get there in a second. But if we look at the heat processing of red kidney beans, which are typically very concentrated with hemagglutinin, which is one of the lectins that can be toxic, if you soak them and then boil them for as little as 15 minutes, the lectins are then undetectable. If you cook them at 80 degrees Celsius for longer, I mean, that's way lower temperature and longer than you would typically do. You can also achieve that. Or if you look at pressure cooking for just 45 minutes, which again is very typical, you abolish lectin levels. Now, I've seen that study, 50 incidents in the UK between 76 and 89. So over 13 years, there were 50 suspected cases. None of them were confirmed. None of them led to death. Some of them were confirmed. Not all of them were confirmed, and none of them led to death. But if we look at things that can happen if you don't properly prepare meat, keeping in mind that with lectins, it is an issue of not properly preparing them. If you don't properly prepare meat, if people aren't informed of cooking the internal temperature of chicken, for example, up to a certain point, it can lead to salmonella. And in fact, if we estimate as we look at the total rate of salmonella cases in the U.S. annually, it's 1.35 million infections, 26,500 hospitalizations, and 420 deaths per year. Remember, 50 suspected cases in the UK over 13 years of lectin poisoning, far more cases of salmonella. And if we look at specifically what would be attributable to white meat, chicken and turkey, it's about 23% of that. So we're looking at over 300,000 infections and about 100 deaths because of that. If we look at the epidemiology of the E. coli outbreaks in the U.S. over a couple decades, we see that the food vehicle for 41% of them was ground beef. And so again, if you don't prepare that properly, it can lead to illness, and this is something that you would buy in the grocery store. And it's not even just about not preparing them properly and then eating them. It could be the case that you didn't store it properly, you didn't clean the counter properly, you mixed it with other things in the sink, and it contaminates that and eventually infects you, and it can be very dangerous, it can be fatal. So and I agree that people need to cook legumes properly. I think we're both on the same page there. And when they do, we see that higher legume intake is associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, a lower risk of all-cause mortality. And as I pointed out earlier, when we substitute meat specifically with legumes, we see improvements in coronary heart disease risk. These are, again, the outcomes I care about. So yes, we need to let people know how to cook legumes properly. Presumably, a lot of people are doing it right based on this evidence, seeing that they have better long-term health outcomes. But in those odd cases where someone doesn't do it right, just like in those odd cases where someone, actually not so odd, presumably common cases where someone doesn't cook their chicken right or doesn't prepare their beef correctly, yeah, they need to be educated on it and make sure that they avoid the issues that can come along with it. So I don't see this as being much of an issue other than those minute cases where, yeah, a bit of education is warranted. And this is something I'd actually like to see some more kind of food education even in schools at a young age. I think it'd be really great. And I think we're starting to see a shift that way a little bit. But yeah, I just don't see it as a big concern. I mean, I'm of Indian background, and I can tell you that Indians know how to cook legumes. They've been doing it for a long time. But it doesn't mean that there aren't odd cases where people are under preparing them.
Yeah. So the point of that is that if you aren't aware, you can get into trouble. And so the denial of plant toxins, which doesn't sound like you are, it sounds like you are saying that you agree there are toxic elements in plants that you need to specifically prepare in order to temper that or to eradicate that. Is that right?
Yeah, so I would say that there are, but I don't think it's as difficult or needs to really be quote unquote specially prepared in a certain way. It seems to be pretty common knowledge outside of specific cases where you see these happen once in a while. But again, the same thing applies to meats as far as not preparing them properly.
Yeah, but understanding that though, and it is passed down. Of course, it is. I was told by my mom that if a potato goes green, you can't eat it; it's bad. Or if it grows a root, you can't eat it; it's bad. But people who don't get told that or not told why that is, they can get hurt.
Yeah, but it seems like you agree also that it is the same with meat, right? It needs to be properly prepared as well. You need to handle it appropriately. You can't have it sitting out on the counters, etc. Right?
Well, certainly it's a food handling issue, and E. coli is a food handling issue. Obviously, that's an enteric bacteria. That's not inherent in the meat. That's coming from someone who didn't wash their hands.
But if you buy it in the grocery store, there is a good chance of it being there if you don't properly prepare the food, right? That's what we were talking about. You're saying if people are just going into the grocery store buying plants, they need to know how to properly prepare it. The same would go for meat, would it not?
The exact same risk comes from having produce that people are handling and meat that people are handling. The difference that meat,
but it's more common in meat,
packaged form,
and it's more common.
It's not actually.
Well, no. So 41% of the 41%.
Far more common.
I just presented data. I just presented data on E. coli infections. 41% of the outbreaks in the U.S. over a 20-year period, at least from 82 to 2002, were due to ground beef. Alone, forget about other animal foods. For produce, it was like 22%, somewhere in that ballpark. So about half.
General food poisoning? What about overall food poisoning?
I mean, I'd like to see evidence if you have that produce is more common.
So that's the thing, is that, this was the issue, the sticking point when we talked about having a debate earlier, was that you said, provide the one study you think that encapsulates your entire argument. It's like, I'm sorry, I have 25 years of background on this. There's not one study. So, I mean, that was a statistic that we were taught commonly in medical school. Yeah. The vast majority of food poisoning was from produce in America.
So in cases of produce, it is from contamination with fecal matter for sure, but it's not, based on the data that we're seeing, the data I just shared, that isn't the case. Ground beef is the primary food vector.
But you're talking specifically about E. coli.
For E. coli, if we look at salmonella, white meat, chicken and poultry is the number one source. What else is
overall
there?
Food poisoning is majority from plants.
But I would like to see evidence for that, right? If you can't provide evidence,
I can try and find that for you. That's just what is commonly
but just because something that's commonly said doesn't make it right. Right? Yeah.
The thing is that what you're saying is completely counter to anything that I've ever been taught or anything I looked up. And specifically talking about salmonella and E. coli, fine. I don't have a problem with that. But that doesn't encapsulate all the known sources of food poisoning.
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, so the idea is that there's inherent risk to consuming plants that you pick up in the grocery store, right? I'm just pointing out that there are inherent risks to just consuming meat that is picked up in the grocery store if not properly handled and prepared, because you can't verify that they aren't contaminated with those things, and in fact it's very common, right? That's my point.
That's fine. The difference being is that that's not something that's inherent in the meat. That's not a quality or a character of the meat itself.
But
that's something that's happened to it.
But
and
that's
so,
something that people need to be aware of, right? That's
100%.
Yeah, exactly,
and
right?
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And so, and that's totally fine. And as insofar as that's concerned, yes, definitely be aware of that. But I don't think it's fair to compare that to inherent toxins in plants, because those are inherent in the plant.
Here's why I think it is, because if you look at the rates of these toxicities to improperly prepared plants, any of those studies you presented on lectin poisoning, you can put it all together, and there are more infections from salmonella from chicken and turkey alone per year in the U.S. alone than over 13 years in the UK, or any of those other incidents combined, right? So that's the problem. You can't just say because, it's inherent that legumes contain lectins, need to be prepared properly, that it's a bigger problem. Clearly it's not. Clearly just putting it out there that it is clearly a bigger issue, affects more people as far as consuming just poultry alone and just considering salmonella. Forget about everything else. That alone is a bigger problem than lectin poisoning from legumes, on a population population scale.
Okay, so since car accidents kill more people than guns, should we just ignore guns?
No, I'm not saying that. I already acknowledge that we should prepare legumes properly and educate people on how to prepare legumes properly. I'm saying that the same, and in fact a stronger critique can be made with regard to animal products and making sure people are preparing them correctly. I think that's a bigger issue. Both need to need education, and I agree. I think we agree on that. But I'm just saying
it's not one or the other.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not one or the other.
I would agree. Yeah, right? I would agree.
So, So just because there's another issue that may harm more people, that doesn't mean that this isn't harming people and we should just ignore it. And the entire purpose of that talk was just to bring this awareness to people. It was not to say that this is the #1 killer in America. It was just to say this is a thing and you should be aware of it. That was it.
And so, but wasn't also, and this might have just been kind of undertone that I took from it, and you can correct me. But it seems like it was also to promote this idea of not eating plants, or at least shifting towards animal products. Whereas when you look at the actual long-term health outcomes, switching those animal products, the meats, for plant protein sources is beneficial, as I've repeated, looking at the data we have on the topic. So if something has this much net benefit and there's a little bit of harm that can be mitigated with education, shouldn't we be aiming for that max benefit with some education to prevent these cases, versus looking at something that actually doesn't seem to provide that benefit for cardiovascular disease, at least in the data that we've looked at, cancers and so on, while also contributing to issues if not prepared properly, handled properly, stored properly? That's the issue that I would take with it.
Well, as Richard Feynman says, it doesn't matter how brilliant your theory is, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. And we don't have experimental studies on this, but when we experiment as clinicians on the ground and we see hundreds and hundreds of patients have the exact opposite outcomes as predicted by these studies, you have to question whether or not these are right or wrong. And that's why I am questioning them, and that's why I'm going back to other sources of information and evidence to say, okay, what are we fundamentally and biologically? One study that I'm sure you want to talk about as well to critique me on is the study looking at the physique and health of the African tribes of Maasai and the Akikuyu. And this is something that people have tried to critique me on, but I don't think they've actually read the study. This looked at two populations, the Maasai in
Can
Kenya,
you just pull it up while you talk about it?
Akikuyu.
Sorry, just to bring. Sure. Can you bring it up while you talk about it?
Yeah, so this is the studies and physique of two African tribes. So this looked at the Akikuyu and the Maasai who live next to each other.
That's not the study, that's just the summary.
Yeah, I know, because this is, I want to show a part of it.
Okay.
This is the study. It's several hundred pages long.
Yeah.
Okay. So this looked at two African populations, the Maasai and the Akikuyu, who are genetically similar because they interbreed, but they also have very, very different nutritional components to their diet. So the Akikuyu are largely vegetarian. They eat some meat, but largely cereals and grains, and the women would eat more greens. And the Maasai would eat quite a lot of milk and meat and blood, especially the hunter class. the warrior class. And they found a lot of physical disparities between the two. So physical measurements of the full-grown Maasai male belonging to the carnivorous tribe to be on average 5 inches taller and 23 pounds heavier than the full-grown male Akikuyu, very similar to the differences in the what's seen pre and post agriculture. And as far as muscular strength, they're determined by diameter to be 50% stronger in the male Maasai versus Akikuyu. And in fact, the Akikuyu males were only slightly stronger than the female Akikuyu and were equivalent to the female Maasai. They also had marked differences such as greater incidence of bone deformities, dental caries, anemia, pulmonary conditions, tropical ulcers among the vegetarian tribes. They talk about the prevalence of intestinal stasis, so constipation, and they also mentioned rheumatoid arthritis. But if you actually look at the data when they look at the hospitals, rheumatism was small, but arthritis was higher. But they said that this was at a mixed hospital with a mixed population. They couldn't actually say that these were Maasai or if this was a mixed population of people from the city as well. So that's comparing a whole food plant-based diet, a whole food meat-based diet, and you're seeing quite significant differences in their development. There's also differences in their overall health. Now, this is saying good, fair, bad, very bad, all that sort of stuff. So, hard to say exactly what's going on there, but there are tables looking at the amounts of diseases that they were hospitalized with or treated as an outpatients for, and the Akikuyu tribe, males and females, were far more likely to be unwell and to seek medical attention or to be hospitalized than the Maasai. There was one gentleman, I don't know his name, but he said that I looked at this wrong, and it was in fact the Akikuyu females who had the best health, but that's not true. They actually, you can see, and these things, these are of the different sorts of boys, girls of Maasai and Akikuyu. In fact, the 100% of the boys were very good, and the Maasai females were slightly less good, but the Akikuyu were much worse. Now the females of the Akikuyu tribe were better than the males of the Akikuyu tribe, but they weren't better than the Maasai, and they largely think that that's due to because they were eating more leafy greens, and they had a better nutritional component from that, had better calcium as a result of that as well, and the Akikuyu men did not have that. So you look at the different incidences of different sorts of issue, bone deformities, dental caries, dental defects, anemia, and enlarged tonsils. This is in the pediatric population under 17. You can see it's heavily skewed towards being worse in Akikuyu versus the Maasai, and the girls again being better than the boys in the Akikuyu, but the men being better than the girls in the Maasai, and the males in the Maasai would generally eat more meat and blood than the females as well. So, this can tell you that a number of different things. Again, it's not an experimental trial. It's not a something that we've controlled for every factor, but it did look at thousands of different people over a number of years, and they found very different outcomes than is predicted by these studies. And again, when you experiment with yourself or with patients and you put them on these different sorts of dietary interventions, they have radically different outcomes from their health than is predicted by these studies. So, Professor John Ioannidis from Stanford said that a lot of these epidemiological studies are pretty difficult to gain any real information from, because when you do an experiment, quite often they don't match up. And so, until we have more experimental data, it's going to be very difficult to say one way or the other, which is why I like to go to what we are really talking about, which is, what are we biologically designed to eat, and what is our biological design? What is best for us based on our biology? And I think that is meat.
I'm just bringing something up really quick, and then I will respond to that. So, going back to that study you just mentioned. Now, for starters, I think there's sort of a lack of relevance to really our discussion here, in that The diet that they were on was pretty well exclusively, was 85% corn, millet, and sweet potatoes. It's not the diet I'm advocating for. Their calcium intake was in the gutter, again, not the sort of diet I'm advocating for. So it doesn't actually tell us about a more well-rounded plant-based diet that's, including, say, calcium fortified foods that's higher in protein and fat, which is what I would ultimately suggest people follow. At the same time, you did mention that or I should mention here that they write in the paper that at present stage we do not feel justified in attempting a detailed discussion of the results obtained or in attempting to draw definite conclusions therefrom, and that's largely because, as you said, this is not of the highest quality. It's they're looking at hospital records in certain areas. There were more hospitals in the area of the other tribe versus the Maasai tribe, and like you said, it's not clear how many people were attending the hospital, or how many Maasai specifically were attending the hospital available to them. It could go either way. Maybe RA, rheumatoid arthritis rates were actually higher in the Maasai. We don't know. They also do mention that while I'll
just point out that they did actually go from tribe to tribe.
And, they did, and the rates were about the same. Yeah, and the rates were about the same as what they noted in the hospital. So even then, like, it suggests that it is probably
slight differences, but yeah.
But more like it's not an earth-shattering difference, right? It was minor differences. Yeah. And they also say that although there has been a good deal of intermarriage between the two tribes, they were originally of different stock, and we have no information as to whether or to what extent the differences in stature and physique may be inherited. So we also don't know for sure. Again, I'm not advocating for this very low protein, low calcium diet anyway, but even so, we can't say for sure that it's not genetic because of the interbreeding. We don't know exactly to what extent that was. Now, what they didn't really touch on here was some of those outcomes that we've been discussing this entire time, things like cardiovascular disease. And so have you looked at data on cardiovascular disease in the Maasai?
So, I mean, cardiovascular disease at that time was really a non-entity.
Wait, so like you're saying it didn't exist at that time?
No, I'm not saying it didn't exist.
Or like very, very rare?
Yeah, well, and potentially in that population, it wasn't that common either. In America, it started becoming one of the number one killers at that time. But 20 years before that was the very first autopsy that proved myocardial infarction.
Just so I'm clear, when you say that it was rare, obviously myocardial infarction, not recorded necessarily for that long. But do you mean like they didn't develop signs of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis? Anything?
So, just go, well, I don't know about it at that time. I mean, certainly now they would. I mean, they've been more incorporated into Western society.
So yeah.
And before 1910 or 1907, there were no documented cases of myocardial infarction death in America. It was completely unheard of. In fact, that wasn't even believed that was a cause of death at that time.
Okay. So I'd like to just share a little bit here. So, atherosclerosis has been characterized in the Maasai. So this is back from the 70s, looking at atherosclerotic plaque development on autopsies of Maasai warriors. And we see that with age, so we get into like 40s here and up to, sorry, what's happening? My browser said something weird. Anyways, I will just, whatever. It's on the Riverside app, some stuff popped up. But we see that atherosclerosis does develop into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and actually matches roughly the amount that we see in U.S. men ages 60 to 69. So it is present. It was present. This is half a century ago. If we look at
but that's half a century after this study was.
Yeah, and I'm not aware. Like, are you aware of actual detailed characterization of like arteries on say
so that was my point, is that all the different health outcomes that they looked at, that wasn't one that they considered, which suggested it wasn't a major outcome.
Well, so it might not have been a cause of death if they weren't living all that long. There wasn't data on life expectancy in the paper you shared, but I just want to go through a few more things because, like Lauren said, we are strapped for time. We can look at 16th century Greenland Inuit mummies, and we see that in this sample 500 or so years ago there was evidence of atherosclerosis. Now they only looked at the 4 mummies that were available to them, and 3 of them had pretty extensive atherosclerosis. And if we look at life expectancy amongst the Inuit, even after considering child mortality, they live significantly less than other Canadians currently. If we look at Inuit population in Greenland, we see that with rapid westernization, as time has gone on, the risk of cardiovascular mortality has declined. And even if we compare to other Canadian populations during a given time period, say in the 90s, we see that the Inuit population actually was worse off than other Canadians as far as cardiovascular disease. We have mummies going back 4,000 years where there was presence even in pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers that there was indeed atherosclerosis in their arteries. And we have some mummies from Lithuania on the right side here also suggesting so. I'm trying to speed through this. Please pause and check these out if anyone wants to read that. And so there are actually clearly documented cases of atherosclerosis by actually opening up the arteries of people who had died for various causes. I mean, a lot of them may have died very young, and so they wouldn't ultimately suffer from an MI, but it was there clearly up to 4,000 plus years ago in pre-agricultural hunter-gatherer populations. Now, the other thing that you had mentioned about epidemiology is that it doesn't translate to outcomes in when we actually do experiments, randomized controlled trials. And in fact, that's not true. So Schwingshackle and co. actually did an analysis looking at the concordance rates between meta-analyses of prospective cohorts and meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And looking at all these outcomes, alpha-linolenic acid and cardiovascular diseases, polyunsaturated fat overall and cardiovascular events, low sodium diets and all-cause cardiovascular mortality, cardiovascular disease, diet quality, etc., down the row. And we see that in 21 out of 23 of these cases, so about 91-92% of cases, the prospective cohorts do actually align with the results fairly well from randomized controlled trials when we put them to the test. And like I cited right out the gate, we have the Leon Diet Heart study as well, which specifically replaced animal foods with plant foods if you look at the statistically significant differences in dietary intake. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty clear that these populations do get atherosclerosis. The study that you cited from the 30s did not look at those long-term outcomes. The Kikuyu, I'm going to butcher the name, they don't eat a diet that I advocate for at all. I don't advocate for that sort of a very low protein, very low fat, very low calcium plant-based diet. So I don't even see it as being relevant to the discussion when I'm talking about these foods and long-term health. As I've demonstrated.
Look, the thing is though, is that you're talking about a whole food plant-based diet, an entire civilization who lived generationally on this, and the argument is that so what you're saying is that a carefully controlled, well-designed vegan diet is okay with supplementation.
It depends on what you mean by carefully controlled, well-designed. I don't think it takes that much effort. In fact, if we look at, like I said, population level data, these aren't people with graduate educations who are all adopting this vegan diet. We see that even actually when adjusting for education, when adjusting for socioeconomic status, they still do better than the meat eaters, right? So it's not some special care that they have.
But you're saying the Akikuyu don't count because they didn't do it right.
No.
But they're living generationally on this.
Well, yeah, I'm saying that, yeah, they aren't doing the iteration of the diet based on living in what is presumably an impoverished area. If we look at Maasai children, they have high rates of anemia too. Like, we don't need to point to these populations who struggle to meet their needs nutritionally regardless of diet when like, that's not what I'm talking about at all. I'm not talking about that diet, and it doesn't take all of this crazy amount of extra care when we're seeing in the population vegans tend to do really, really well long term as far as chronic disease rates, right? That's what matters. And clearly they're doing it okay.
Well, I mean, some are, but again, in practice, in experiment, when people are doing this, they are improving. I'm seeing people directly improved by this, by the thousands. And so, that doesn't meet up with the studies, but you know what? A lot of studies have been wrong many times for many reasons. And because they just aren't designed to be perfect. They just can't be, and they have implicit biases for a number of different reasons. And there are different sources like the University of Washington doing a review on hundreds of different cancer studies looking at red meat and processed meat, but in particular unprocessed meat, and they found that the studies were quite poor quality.
Sorry, which paper in particular?
So I think at this point, I think what we have to do is agree to disagree.
Well,
in that the reality is that what you guys are both saying is that we have a lot of studies that prove my point or prove others' points. And what we're both saying, all of us are saying, is that also some studies just are bad. And there's just a lot going on there. That's not to fault either one of you for your perspectives or your opinions on either.
Well, I would agree with that. Just, I mean, the same, but the thing is, the same can be applied to smoking. We can look at, there are studies that suggest it is associated with a lower risk of lung cancer, but what we do is we dive into the methods. Anthony himself, agreed that is the case, and we point out why one study is necessarily better than another. That's what I would do here, and I don't think that's been done on my side. And in fact, if I had, let's say I had a bunch of clients I was working with, obviously this isn't true, but I was having them smoke and they were losing weight, they were reducing their anxiety, they had some mental clarity, so to speak. Would I be promoting that as a healthy diet? And I'm not, or a healthy thing to do. I'm not saying that that's equivalent. I'm just saying that these anecdotes, we're not following people for 50 years. You haven't been in practice that long, neither have I. What is ultimately being suggested here is that, oh yeah, these swaps in the context of a less healthy diet, you swap meat for plants is beneficial, but all of a sudden if you go to all meat, it's beneficial versus that swap slightly towards more plants. It doesn't make any sense. That you're talking about a curve that goes like this or something, or actually the other way.
But what that suggests is, again, experiment is what trumps all. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. And so I haven't gone through that study you're referencing, so I don't know, the specific sort of, ins and outs of it. So I can't critique it at the moment. But what I can tell you is that if you are doing something and it gets the exact opposite results of what any study suggests, then that study is wrong. Or there's some sort of flaw in it.
If I put people on smoking, but if I told people to start smoking and they lost weight, they felt better, they had mental clarity, is that a good thing?
Yeah, but that's not what I'm saying.
No, I know that's not what you're saying. I'm saying that
rheumatoid arthritis and MS.
Okay, so here, this is good.
So I'm gonna
wait, but this is really good. Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis, smoking actually helps in those cases. So if I put someone on, someone started smoking,
it's literally everything. It's literally everything.
You can't
I have
make that
patients whose CAC score goes down after a year of being on a carnivore diet. And I have patients whose insulin resistance goes down, and their leptin goes down, and their CRP goes down.
I can say the same thing about a vegan diet. I can say the exact same thing about a vegan diet.
But what I'm saying is that when you put someone on an exclusively meat diet, they get better. So your study that says...
Well, compared to garbage, maybe. Compared to garbage, maybe.
No. I'm talking about people that were doing whole food, plant-based diet and attempting to be healthy.
Audio capture, not
so what if I... No.
You're assuming that only people improving are the ones that are coming from a processed food diet. That is not the case. There is thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people who are coming from a plant-based diet, a whole food diet, or a whole food omnivorous diet that are seeing massive improvements in their health. It is not just a processed food diet going to a carnivore diet. That does exist.
And
that's not.
We're seeing harm as well. We're seeing a lot of harm as well. Carnivore cringe, like I said, anyone look that up on Instagram. I've had people message me. I've had people message me saying, "Hey, I tried carnivore, was terrible. I went, vegan, better than I've ever been." We can play the anecdote game back and forth. What matters is when we actually look at...
When you fix it, like you said, the Akiku don't count, that they didn't do your style of vegan diet. That's fine. I have a lot of people who message me as well and saying they are having problems. And I work with them and I troubleshoot for them, and then they improve and they get better. I have yet to see someone come to me with problems and not be able to figure it out with them, not a single time.
And we can play the anecdote game back and forth. It doesn't tell us anything. These aren't verified.
Not an anecdote game.
No, but
this is real life. This is experiment.
Anecdotes, they are anecdotes. They are actually, by definition, anecdotes.
Yeah. So, the plural of anecdote is data. And when you are dealing with patients on the ground, and this is what you're seeing, and it's going against recommendations.
Okay, so
But
what I think
hypothetically,
we
if I
should
told
do,
people
no,
to start
no, what I
smoking,
think,
but
what I think
no,
we should do, what I think we
but
should do is probably wrap it here, and then we can have a follow up from this that y'all can follow up on
okay.
individually. I mean, this could go on forever and ever, right? Which I would love it to, but we can't. I think if that is cool with you guys, why don't we just agree to disagree there on some of those points? But I think also, I do really think that the commonality is that we know processed food sucks. We know that. We know that a lot of data out there is flawed. We know that there's a lot of data out there that's good. We also know that what everybody's doing right now doesn't work, right? So the thing that both of you guys are doing is trying to help people and trying to help people be better because you found something that worked for you, right? And so why would you not share that with other people? And you also found that it works for however many other people out there. That's why you're talking about it, right? So I think ultimately at the end of the day, I think there's a lot to agree on there. And I do look forward to the next follow-up conversation that we can have with this. What I'm going to do is put your guys' socials below, okay, so that everybody can follow you. I believe you guys send those to me, whatever you think they would be. But give me like a couple sentence ending from both of you guys if anything else is like a closing out. Why don't you go, Dr. Nagra first?
Yeah, so, at the end of the day, like I've kind of come back to a few times throughout, is that what I care about are those long-term health outcomes, and consistently when we look at higher consumption of plant foods, whether that's at the expense of a so-called standard American diet or whether that's at the expense of meat particularly, we see benefits. We consistently see improvements in cardiovascular risk, cancer risk, type 2 diabetes risk. We've touched on a lot of ideas throughout this. I think that's ultimately the thing that it comes back to, at least for me, right? Because that's what I care about as a healthcare provider. But also, I don't think there was any critiques. Now, I know Anthony mentioned that he needs to brush up on these studies in order to critique them, and I'm happy to come back for a part 2 so we can have that chat. But thus far, as far as substitution analyses, there have been no critiques as far as the long-term RCT in the form of the Lyon Diet Heart, suggesting that replacing animal foods with plant foods, leading to about a 70% reduction in mortality. There has been no critique. And as far as anecdotes, like, look, we can tell people to smoke and they improve Parkinson's disease, ulcerative colitis risk. It doesn't mean that it's good long-term. These patients haven't been followed long-term to see if they've developed diseases that take 40, 50, 60 years to occur. And that's what I'm worried about, is that people are going to adopt these sorts of dietary practices and run into issues way down the line, like I've shown, even in those ancestral populations. Inuit mummies from 500 years ago, mummies from Egypt 4,000 years ago. Mummies from Lithuania 400 years ago. We see that they do develop atherosclerosis, and it can be quite extensive. So even if we look at those cultures presumably following those dietary practices, still not a good thing long term.
So I would just say that the reason I don't really pay too much heed to these studies is because they aren't great, and so we don't. So studies on my side or your side or whatever, they're not great, and so they're not proving anybody one way or the other. And we have a number of conflicting points of evidence. So that's why I think you need to go to our biological nature, what we are designed to eat. I don't think that you've made a cogent argument on why that's okay to not eat what we're designed to eat, and why it's not okay for basically any other animal on earth to do that, why that's particular to us, that we can eat something that didn't exist 50 years ago, let alone 50,000 years ago. And so the idea that we can just dismiss people that are improving dramatically, I don't think is right either. We're saying that yes, you reduce your diabetes, which first of all significantly reduces your risk of developing heart disease, eliminated metabolic disease, which also significantly reduces your risk of heart disease and other sorts of illnesses, and then that doesn't matter because long term maybe something will happen. Well, maybe, but it's really going against the objective evidence, which is that they're improving. And you have people improving on Alzheimer's, ulcerative colitis, Crohn's. If someone's having bloody diarrhea 30 times a day, they need help. And this is something that helps, and this is something that's in the literature showing that it helps. People with MS, people die from MS, and so saying that, well, maybe 30, 40, 50 years down the road, someone can have problems. Well, they're not dead from MS. So that's good. So I'm glad they got 40 years to die of something else. You see people in nursing homes, coming out of nursing homes. There's a gentleman in Scottsdale, Arizona, who is now with hundreds of people, rehabbed terminal Alzheimer's patients and gotten them home again by doing these sorts of dietary interventions. So maybe they die of something 10 years down the road, but you know what? They're not dying of dementia and Alzheimer's right now. So that's an improvement. As to mummies having atherosclerosis, there's a number of different things that cause atherosclerosis. Smoking, stress is a major one. Probably the only experimental trial that's ever shown reduction or reversal of atherosclerotic plaques were stress relief, people meditating for 40 minutes a day and improving their outcomes with atherosclerosis. So, people living in 1600s Greenland could be very stressed. It's a harsh environment. You're in Greenland, and it's during the mini ice age. And so that's not a very fun condition to be in. It could be very stressful. There are also mummies looking at in Egypt during post-agricultural revolution, when they were largely eating grains and they showed atherosclerosis and so forth. And so this isn't just typical of people that eat meat or exclusive to those people that eat meat. Atherosclerosis
I just want to say I never
exclusive.
said that. I just want to clarify that's not my position, that it's exclusive.
Okay.
What did you say? Sorry? What did
Yeah,
you
yeah,
say?
no, I just wanted to clarify, just so that it's not taken as that's my position.
Yeah.
It's not my position that the only cause is meat consumption, just to clarify.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. And so, I mean, that's the thing, it is interesting these people have atherosclerosis, but there can be different factors. It's not just, one thing or the other. Looking at the heart disease rates and poor outcomes in the Greenland population versus, Canadians or other populations, there are plenty in that same time period of Canadian Inuits that show the exact opposite.
That was
And
Canadian to
before
Canadian, FYI. It was Canadian.
Okay,
to
so
Canadian.
we're
Okay,
wrapping.
But no, I'm just pointing out because it's mischaracterizing what I said. I'm just clarifying.
I know, but I think
apologize.
that's more
Yeah.
just
So, all
more
I'm
just the
saying
point
is
of this is a
that
closing general
this is so this is again just again and again and again there's an abundance of conflicting evidence, which is why I think that you have to go to first principles. You have to go to the bedrock of the situation and look at biologically what we are and what we are designed to eat. I don't think it holds that what we are designed biologically to eat is going to be harmful to us long term. I just don't think that holds true.
Okay, awesome. Well, I appreciate both you guys. I really do. I really appreciate you guys very much. Thank you for doing this.